right, my friends, good morning. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I know that we have our folks from AIR who have a hard stop at noon. Is this accurate? Perfect. So I want to make sure that we're being respectful. We do have quorum now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I am going to turn it over to the ever-amazing Miss Esther Coe to get us started.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And we are really delighted to be here today to discuss with the school board members about the Year 1 Special Education Review Report prepared by our researchers, American Institute for Research. So today we have with us is our principal investigator, Ms. Allison Gandhi, and then also our senior director, Ms. Lindsay Hayes. So we have been working together very closely for the past year, but amazingly, today is my first time meeting them in person, so we all share the same, the same thing today, the same fact, so we're really looking forward to it. So before I turn it over to Lindsay and Allison to talk about the methodology, to talk about the emerging strengths and areas of focus and the planning for Year 2, I would like to take us to just briefly to look at the overview of the project, which is on slide 6. So if the clerk can help me to advance there, to talk a little bit about the background of this review, that it is coming from the school board back in December 2019. There was a forum topic that requesting my office of Auditor General, to amend our audit plan to facilitate a review of our special education services. And then in May 2020, we issued a request for proposal, which is an open competition process to solicit proposal from vendors to conduct this review. And the committee, the evaluation committee, agreed 100% to recommend a contract awarded to AIR. And my office is served as the project liaison of this review. And then the contract was awarded to AIR back in October of 2020. In terms of the what is covered in the review, which is under slide 7 of the slides, and there are 4 major areas. The first one is to look at the design structure and the established processes. And the second one is to evaluate the human capital resources aspect. And the third area is to see if our practices are aligned with evidence-based practices. Last but not the least is to evaluate the communication with key stakeholders about the special education program. And with that, I would like to hand the time to our researchers so that they can take roughly like 30 minutes to walk through the slides with us, and then we will save the other 60 minutes or so for the school board members for Q&A. So with that.
And just really quickly, colleagues, I know as we go through, you guys are going to have questions that are triggered. If you will just do the practice of tilting up your name tags, I would super appreciate it. And we'll go from there. We will do 3 minutes timed for us and for staff. And so I just wanted to set expectation before you guys got started, but we're going to hold our questions until the end.
There we go. Good morning. Thanks so much for having us. I'm Allison Gandhi, and I'm going to start providing an overview of our approach to the project. I'll talk about our methodology, and then Lindsay is going to provide a summary of the emerging themes that came out from the first year of the review. So I want to go to slide 8. Great. So I'll start with the 3 big goals that guided our approach to this review. First, although of course we are conducting this as an independent third party, we recognize that in order for the review to be successful, we need it to be directly relevant to your particular needs, and so there were some aspects of the review that were conducted in a collaborative manner. So we did work with FCPS leaders, we worked with the board to finalize data collection protocols to make sure that they are all addressing the research questions. We also worked with FCPS leaders to gain access to stakeholders and sources of data that we needed in order to answer the questions. Second goal is to maintain sensitivity to the current education landscape in Fairfax County, and specifically, we have to acknowledge that COVID-19 is a huge challenge that the district is facing, as is every district in the country. We did make an intentional decision in the beginning of the review to focus our data collection on practices in place prior to the pandemic, because that is when the review was commissioned. That said, COVID-19 is a really important backdrop that's very hard to ignore. And so we had to be sensitive to this in our data collection and in our analyses. We also needed to make sure to distinguish between challenges that are there because of COVID versus challenges that are there regardless of COVID. Our third goal is to generate recommendations for changes that are actionable, evidence-based, and that will improve services for students with disabilities and their families in FCPS. Today, we are presenting emerging themes from phase one, but next year the plan is to be able to present more concrete findings along with recommendations for changes that you can make to address those findings. So we can go to slide 9. This is our project timeline. So this project is 2 years, and we're conducting it in 2 phases. So the first phase, which we just completed, consists of data collection activities that we were able to conduct off-site. This was partly necessary due to COVID, but also the intent with these data collection activities was to get a big picture of areas of strength and possible areas of improvement that we would then look at and help inform our prioritization of topics to dig into more deeply in phase 2. So what we're presenting today is that report 1 in the middle, our interim report, where we will present what we learned from the data collection activities in phase 1. And I'm going to go through those data collection activities briefly on the next few slides, but just to give you a sense of what's coming up in phase 2, we will be conducting a much more extensive number of focus groups with a much broader group of stakeholders. We'll also be conducting classroom observations. At the end of the presentation, we will come back to the phase 2 plans and talk a little more about those plans and next steps. All right, so we can move now into the methodology, and you can go right to slide 11. And I want to start with limitations, because that is really critical to understand and interpret what we're going to share today. So what Lindsay will share, again, are emerging themes that came out of the phase 1 data collection. It includes both areas of strength and areas of focus. And again, the goal for identifying emerging themes is to help us make decisions about what are the topics that we need to learn more about and to dig more deeply into in phase 2. And then finally, we just want to stress that because these are emerging themes, they may change depending on what we learn in phase 2. So anything that we share today should not be considered final findings or conclusions. All right, so going to the next slide, I'm going to walk through now each of the 6 data sources for phase 1. So the first is extant data, and we looked at a combination of data provided to us from FCPS as well as some publicly available data. Our goal with extant data was to gain a contextual understanding first of how FCPS is doing with respect to key special education compliance indicators. So these are indicators that are reported to the state and to the Federal Department of Education as well. We wanted to investigate trends over time and also look at some differences across demographic groups. So some of the data sources we looked at: demographic data, outcome data, compliance data, 504 plan data, as well as data related to staffing. Next slide. We reviewed documents, and our main purpose in reviewing these documents was to learn more about special education programming and procedures in FCPS to give us that contextual understanding to inform our analysis of the other data we are collecting. We reviewed over 200 documents and web-based resources, so policy guidance documents, instructional materials, professional development offerings, strategic planning documents. We also had access to a document that had comments from school board members and parent advocacy groups, and this was important for us to have a record of what are the comments and concerns that led to commissioning this review in the first place. Next slide, we conducted a review of IEPs. So we pulled IEPs for a random representative sample of 300 students with disabilities. The sample was representative in terms of school region, age, grade, disability type, race, ethnicity, English learner status, and gender. We used a coding protocol to assess the IEPs both in terms of procedural requirements, compliance with procedural requirements, as well as indicators of substantive quality. We also conducted a full history review for a subsample of 50 of those IEPs. And in that review, we focused mostly on the assessments and the procedures for the initial eligibility determinations. Okay, next slide, we conducted 2 surveys. The first is a survey of staff. This was an online survey that went out to all instructional staff in March. Survey items were aligned to these 4 goal areas of the review. It included a mix of Likert scale items as well as 3 open-ended response items. The response rate was 32%, which is consistent with what we have seen and experienced in other reviews of this type with districts similar to Fairfax County. And then you can go to the next slide, the parent survey. We also conducted an online survey of all parents of students with IEPs and 504 plans in FCPS. Again, survey items were aligned to the goals of the review. They were mostly Likert scale items with 1 open-ended response item. We were able to administer the survey in 9 languages, so reflecting the 9 most commonly spoken languages in the district. And the response rate here was 55%, which is considerably higher than what we would expect and what we've experienced in other reviews of this type. And then finally, we had 2 focus groups with what we call key informants. So these are FCPS leaders who have important contextual knowledge about special education in the district. And it was important for us to speak to these key informants first before embarking on the much more intensive focus group effort that we will undertake in phase 2. So we had 1 focus group with administrators and 1 with FCPS central office staff. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay now to present the emerging themes.
Thank you, Allison. So I'm going to talk about the emerging strengths and areas of focus from the interim report. There are 18 emerging themes total, so by necessity today, to be respectful of the time limits, my overview will have to be at a very high level, but very much encourage and welcome your questions to go into more depth on any of these emerging strengths and areas of focus. So if we can go to slide 19, please. The emerging themes are organized around the 4 goal areas that Esther previewed for us at the beginning. Goal area 1 is design structures and processes for special education. So I'm going to move into the first emerging theme that is a strength. So that is on slide 20. So the first emerging strength is that FCPS is meeting targets for compliance timelines related to referral, eligibility determination, and IEP development processes. The compliance rates in terms of IEP timelines are generally very high. In addition, parents and staff are reporting that FCPS has effective processes for identifying students with disabilities, and parents are reporting that FCPS schools are facilitating parental involvement as a means to improve services and results for students with disabilities. As always, for any of these emerging themes, what we want to do is ensure that there are multiple sources of data that are going into each of these. So at the bottom of this slide and each subsequent slide that describes emerging themes, you will see the data sources that we drew from to support the emerging theme. So you can see here that this was mostly substantiated through a review of extant data as well as the staff and parent surveys. Next slide, please. The next emerging strength is that the FCPS Department of Special Services has established guidance, procedures, and leadership related to special education programming and instruction. This emerging strength really deals with the idea of infrastructure around leadership for special education. We can see that emphasis on an inclusive culture echoed in the FCPS strategic plan. There are comprehensive written documents of policies and procedures related to special education. And we know that, of course, that there is a robust leadership structure within the Department of Special Services, including regional support components that are intended to support special education programming in the district. Next slide, please. Our first emerging theme that is an area of focus for further investigation in year 2 of this review is around the idea that FCPS parents, staff, and parents have expressed concern about the degree to which special education policy and programming decisions reflect their needs and input. Again, we want to stress that this is an emerging theme that we intend to more fully investigate through data collection in year 2. But some common themes that emerged in parent feedback that we believe merit further exploration include lengthy timelines for testing, difficulty getting appropriate services once identified, and lack of transparency and accountability about IEP goals and progress for individual students. Themes that we saw from the staff survey that we believe merit further exploration include difficulty of initiating those testing procedures, ensuring that students with disabilities are included when planning new programs and services, and of course, collaboration between general education and special education, because we know it is not solely the responsibility of the special educators in Fairfax County Public Schools to educate students with disabilities. It's everyone's responsibility. So that is an area in which we believe merits further investigation in year 2 because of this inconsistent interpretation and or implementation of special education policies, particularly at the school level. And this is something we will definitely take a look at through year 2 data collection. Next slide, please. The next emerging theme deals with suspension and expulsion rates, particularly that they vary based on demographic factors. So in taking a look for this emerging theme, we did a lot of extant data analysis as well as document analysis related to discipline policies in FCPS. And of course, we are looking really for equity here. We want to make sure that students with disabilities in FCPS are not being suspended or facing expulsion at rates higher than their general education peers. So that was one of the ways in which we looked at this data. During the 2018-2019 school year, FCPS was identified as a Virginia school division having a significant discrepancy in the rate of long-term suspension and expulsions for students with IEPs. Another way in which we looked at this was comparing students in different race and ethnicity groups, another way that we examined equity. So we can see that in 2016, 2017, and 2018, FCPS was identified as having a significant discrepancy by race or ethnicity in the rate of long-term suspensions and expulsions for children with IEPs. We do think it is important to note that although FCPS was found to have discrepancies in those areas on the special education performance report that is required for state and federal reporting for those respective years, it concluded, the Virginia Department of Education concluded that the policies, procedures, or practices that contributed to the significant discrepancy and do not comply with the requirements relating to the development of IEPs, the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports, and procedural safeguards. They indicated that the response to that was no. So they do not believe that policies, procedures, or practices contributed to this discrepancy. So that is an important thing to note. On the next 2 slides, you can see graphs that we pulled out from the appendix of our interim report illustrating some of those discrepancies in the suspension data. If you would like to take a look at that, I encourage you to go into the appendix of the interim report and take a look at Exhibit B8 and B9, because you can see the ways in which we compared the general education and special education populations in terms of discipline, and also how we compared the percentage of students with disabilities receiving these disciplinary actions with the percentage of the overall student population that these students make up. If we advance to slide 26, to our third area of focus, we can see that additional resources are needed to support certain populations of students, specifically English language learners or ELs, and twice exceptional learners or our 2E learners. Through document analysis, the surveys, and key informant groups, this was a common theme that emerged across these data sources. We know that there are a substantial number of students with disabilities in Fairfax County Public Schools who are also English language learners. And stakeholder feedback really indicated that there was a need for further exploration, particularly around the referral and identification practices for ELs. Parents also expressed some concerns with the quality of instructional programming and placements for our twice exceptional learners, particularly related to instructional rigor and the ability to be scheduled into classes that meet their needs, have access to the kinds of programming that these students need. Our next slide, please. Our next emerging theme is that students with disabilities, their families, and their educators need additional support to prepare for post-secondary transition. So we know this is a very important point in the life of a student with a disability and their family, is planning for career, independent living, and post-secondary education when they complete their educational journey in Fairfax County Public Schools. So we took a look mostly through extant data analysis, document analysis, and of course the surveys about some of the themes that we were seeing. And we are seeing that students with disabilities in FCPS being enrolled in higher education or post-secondary training. Within 1 year of leaving high school, there is some room for improvement there. And taking a look at that extant data and also what was substantiated with that in the surveys, parents are suggesting that the process by which student input is gathered for the IEP may be driven by compliance rather than student needs. So we certainly want to see that students at this very critical point of their educational journey are having their input considered in planning for the supports that they will need. The next emerging theme is around IEPs, and specifically that IEPs do not include sufficient data-based information to guide individualized education planning. It's important to note that this is really where the IEP review that Allison described earlier strongly comes into play. So that review of that random representative sample of IEPs, we took a deep dive into those IEPs to take a look at things like goal development, the baseline data that was used to develop those goals, how they were creating measurable short-term objectives, and then how they were matching those with placement and supports. So only 26% of the IEP sample that we reviewed included data in their present level of performance summaries, most relying on subjective data rather than objective measurable data. We saw room for improvement around the annual goals and short-term objectives in that they were likely to include measurable and observable behavior, but we're not coupling that with appropriate and or differentiated condition or criterion for measuring whether a student actually achieved that goal. And only 30% of the IEP sample included a detailed rationale explaining why the selected placement was appropriate for the student's needs. Of course, we are very interested in that because all students with disabilities must be educated in their least restrictive environment. We also, for a subsample of 50 of those 300 IEPs, conducted a full history review. So going back not only for the most recent IEP, but back into the history of the student and when they initially became eligible for special education. And those reviews revealed inconsistent documentation of the information and data used to make those eligibility decisions. Those were the emerging strengths around areas of focus around Goal 1, which was design structures and processes. And now I'm going to transition to talking about emerging strengths and areas of focus for Goal 2, which is around human capital resources. Next slide, please. One more, thank you. So the first emerging strength in this area is that parents of students with IEPs are generally satisfied with the quality of FCPS instructional staff. I think we saw in the survey that there were certainly instances where parents were very appreciative, particularly of individual educators, individual school teams that came together and really put a community of support around their child. So we saw a significant majority of parent survey respondents agreeing or strongly agreeing that they were satisfied with the quality of teaching in their child's school. They also had good things to say about staff members, believing that staff did a good job delivering the services written on their child's IEP. And again, left many positive comments expressing appreciation for how hard Fairfax County employees work for their children. Next slide, please. The next emerging strength that we saw is that FCPS offers a wide range of professional development activities for staff supporting students with disabilities. This emerging theme deals specifically with the robustness of the offerings. Based on our review of extensive professional development documents and some results from the staff survey, we saw a range of both synchronous and asynchronous professional development activities, trainings that were on a variety of content areas, topics, strategies for specialized populations, and infrastructure around PD through the MyPDE system, linking professional development and the evaluation component. So overall, saw an emerging strength around the infrastructure for PD. A third emerging strength is that FCPS has consistently maintained a lower student to special education teacher ratio than the state average. This was part of our extant data analysis, In our research questions, one thing we are interested in looking at is comparing how FCPS looks with other districts, both in the state of Virginia and across the country, districts that are comparable in terms of size and student makeup. And we saw that the ratio of students with disabilities to special education teachers in FCPS has held fairly steady at about 10 students per special education teacher, and actually decreased to 9 students per special education teacher in the 2020-2021 school year. Again, this ratio is consistently lower than the Virginia state average during that same time period, which was approximately 15 students per special education teacher. And again, this has remained relatively consistent over time. Our first emerging area of focus in the human capital area is that novice teachers, especially those who are not fully licensed, lack preparation and professional development supports targeted at working with students with disabilities. So in 2020, FCPS employed 447 provisionally licensed special education teachers and almost 3,000 fully licensed special education teachers. And this is definitely higher than the Virginia state average and the rates in neighboring Virginia school divisions. And in addition to that extant data analysis showing us that there is a population of these provisionally licensed teachers, we saw emerging themes through the document analysis and the staff survey that these novice teachers are coming in without the preparation to work with students with disabilities. And so we are seeing that staff survey respondents, a significant proportion agreed or strongly agreed that teachers new to the profession or new to teaching students with disabilities are receiving additional specialized professional development supports. This is certainly something that we want to investigate further in year 2 in terms of the offerings related specifically to professional development on students with disabilities. Next slide, please. Our next emerging area of focus is that staff report difficulty managing their special education related workloads. Although we mentioned that an emerging strength was that the student-teacher ratio is lower than the state average, we did see through survey responses mostly that many staff members reported not feeling like they did not have enough time or support to provide that sufficient individualized attention to students with disabilities. Many of them reported feeling overwhelmed by case management, meeting duties, paperwork, things of that nature. And we also believe that this is connected to FCPS's ability to effectively recruit and retain teachers. So that's another thing that we believe is something we need to investigate further in year 2. Next slide, please. Our third emerging theme is that the FCPS staffing allocation formula may be driving decisions to inflate service hours on students' IEPs rather than considerations of student need. This is based on a review of extant data. Something that we looked at is what is the distribution of students with certain amounts of hours on their IEP. And what we saw is that there is a pretty significant spike at students who are receiving 16 hours of specialized instruction per week, so a spike followed by an immediately sharp decrease. You can see that illustrated on the next slide, slide 37. And what we would like to investigate further in year 2 is whether this is related to the staffing allocation formula. That 16 hours of instruction is significant to the staffing allocation formula because that is what is used to determine level 1 students versus level 2 students. A level 1 student receiving less than 16 hours of specialized instruction per week and a level 2 student receiving 16 or more hours. So we think it is interesting that there is a significant spike right at 16 followed by an immediate decrease back down to where it was. So we want to conduct further investigation into this issue in year 2. Let's go ahead to slide 39. We're now on our third goal area, which is evidence-based practices. We will speak to this in a moment, but for strengths, we did not feel like we had conducted enough data collection at this time to identify emerging themes as strengths. We intend to perform classroom observations in year 2, and we believe that this is really the data collection activity that is best poised to give us that information about evidence-based practices. But we do highlight a couple areas for further investigation in year 2. So let's go to slide 42, please. The first emerging theme is that there is general concern about the quality of inclusive practices in FCPS. This was as the result of extant data analysis, document analysis, and pretty substantively that review of 300 IEPs. We're seeing that in 2018, 2019, FCPS did not meet the Virginia state targets for least restrictive environment for students aged 6 through 21. Again, this is very critical because all students need to be educated in their least restrictive environment. We also saw that this in 2018, 2019 held true as well for preschool children with IEPs. And we also saw stakeholder feedback with a general theme desiring greater consistency for inclusive programming across schools and regions, and making sure that all students have access to academic and social inclusion opportunities. So things, again, like academies, electives, making sure all students have access to those. On the next slide, you can see Exhibit B5 in our interim report if you are interested in looking at those sort of the Virginia State Special Education Performance Indicators I mentioned. But we're going to move ahead to slide 44. The next area of focus is that the connection between multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, and special education can be improved. Something that we saw through document analysis, a staff survey, the IEP review, the key informant groups, is this idea that staff generally lack understanding of MTSS policies and procedures, including how special education fits in with MTSS. And generally that these practices and procedures, they vary very much across schools. So some concerns have emerged about the adequacy of supports to school staff. We generally saw a lot of those concerns dealt with dealing with extreme behaviors, and MTSS as a school-wide preventative strategy to help prevent some of those behaviors. And we really saw a need to further explore the effectiveness of Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions and practices, and we'll do so in Year 2. So next slide, for our final goal area, communication. We identified one emerging strength and two emerging areas of focus. On the next slide, that emerging area of strength is that FCPS has taken actions to improve communication with school staff. Our research questions in the communication area are very focused on the directionality of communication. For instance, is there effective communication from the school to the district, from the district to the school, from schools to parents, from parents to schools? So making sure, again, that all of those communication pieces are in place. And we do see an emerging strength that FCPS is putting that infrastructure in place to improve communication with school staff, including prioritizing communication about special education processes, appointing an assistant ombudsman, and providing written documentation to support referral and eligibility. For our next slide, our emerging area of focus is that the amount and quality of communication specifically between the parents and the school varies very much by school. So we saw a general lack of consistency in school-level practices related to special education, and that may be contributing to school-parent communication challenges. Staff survey respondents were more likely to agree than school-level staff. They provided information about services for students with disabilities, and we saw that was slightly different than what parents were saying on the survey. And we also see that those challenges in school-parent communication are especially prevalent during those transitions between schools. For instance, the transition between elementary school and middle school. Next slide, please. The next area of focus is that parents and staff have differing opinions about the collaborative process to develop IEPs. And we really saw this come into play both through the staff and parent surveys and in the IEP review, just a differing perceptions between parents and staff about what the input process needs to look like during IEP development. So although we saw high levels of agreement that parents thought they had adequate opportunities for input into the development, we saw during the IEP review that only 38% of those we reviewed in the sample included any evidence of their input. So the survey responses suggest to us that there is further need for investigation of collaboration between staff and parents for IEP development in Year 2. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk briefly about what this means for Phase 2 and then very much welcome your questions about Phase 2. Phase 2, beginning this school year, we are conducting several data collection activities that I think will help us better understand some of those emerging themes I just mentioned. Of course, I have already talked about stakeholder focus groups targeted specifically to the improvement areas identified in this report. We are intending right now to run 20 groups with 6 to 8 participants each. The 6 to 8 participants each is definitely to ensure that participants have the opportunity to be heard during that focus group. We will conduct extensive classroom observations with a focus on evidence-based practices, again, that goal area 3. There will be 100 on-site observations conducted across 20 schools. And for the third data collection activity, we recognize that there is need to continue to work with the extant data that we gathered in year 1. There are a lot more ways that that data can be disaggregated and further analyzed. So we're going to continue to perform those data analysis activities, especially for subgroups within the special education population. And with that, we thank you for listening and welcome your questions.
We're going to give you guys an A+ for somehow getting through 53 slides and that. We're real sticklers about it, so this is great. All right, what we're going to do, if you have already put up your name tag, I've got you written down. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser's getting my attention. All right, and so 3 minutes, guys. Now we have clocks on either side, so everybody should be able to see, and we're going to try to limit staff answers to 3 minutes as well. We have, I know, a lot of material to get through. So, yeah, no excuses for I didn't see my time is up, people. All right, we are first beginning with Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Ms. Keys-Gamara.
With all respect, I think I was second with my tag up, but I'm happy to go.
I'm happy to let Ms. Keys-Gamara. I just looked over and you were both up, so that's my fault.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys. I am so glad that the audit committee, our audit department worked with us to try to expand the role so that we could really intersect with the concerns of the community. And you guys have done a great job, I think, in responding. And so I want to focus my questions around kind of how we keep the community informed given what we are finding and how we're going to go forward. So my focus is going to be how we're collaborating with our special services department to report to the board with respect to what are our priorities in response to this. I kind of throw this out to my colleagues to see if you guys agree with this approach, but also to be able to report to the board, hopefully, what that response is, not, in line with what you're reporting, to make sure that the community knows that this isn't just an exercise. What's the matter? Okay. This isn't just an exercise, but we're actually trying to get things done. So I think some of the concerns that really hit me, first of all, had to do with the IEP data lacking information showing specific support and data regarding why they are making these recommendations for this particular child. That's on page 19, 28, and 49. And of specific concern was documentation of parent input. A second priority, as far as I'm concerned, too many bells and fingers right now. Give me my seconds back. Also on page 19, the differences in suspension and expulsion rates that vary by demographics. I think that we need to hear, and if I could, I don't want to keep dumping. I already let Michelle know, our director know that we would be that I would be asking these questions. So before I keep going on, those are my top two. If she wants to respond, how we're taking this information and processing. I know that this is preliminary, but I do think that our community is going to see this report. They're going to have significant concern, and I think the most important thing is how we respond.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, and thank you to the AIR team and Ms. Coe in the audit office for this opportunity. We are going to be unpacking the information, specifically the detailed responses in our parent survey. Just to speak just very briefly, one of the areas that Ms. Keys-Gamarra spoke to is about the documentation of parent input in the IEP. That's certainly a critical piece for us. We want to make sure that our staff who are developing those IEPs are documenting that appropriately. And we want to make sure that we're connecting pieces. As we look at this staff survey, 92.5% of our parents indicated they strongly agreed that they had adequate opportunities to give input into the IEP process. So our taking it the next step is ensuring that our case managers who receive that information from parents appropriately document it on that IEP. And so those are the pieces that we are just, very grateful for this opportunity, but really want to make sure that we dig deep so that as we are responding, we're responding in the appropriate manner and addressing or remedying the appropriate area of need based on really detailed disaggregation of comprehensive data.
I'm also concerned about those parents who reported they didn't feel like they had a meaningful opportunity to participate, and so that would be a significant focus for me. As my time ticks down, I'd like to see how we can incorporate this into our school improvement plans and also deal with the recruiting and retention as well as MTST practices lacking consistency. So I'm trying to figure out how we deal with the communication of that and making sure the community understands that we're taking improvement steps and we're reporting that to the community as we go along. I know this touches a lot of departments, but I don't think we're effective without all of them.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you for your grace.
No, of course. Dr. Anderson, actually, you're up next. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, set me straight.
I thought I was going to be third. Thank you. Just going to kind of go through here to try to be expeditious with my time. Much of this data is obviously perception data, and we see that tension, particularly in the communication area. How do you recommend that we receive that information? Because it is perception data. And do you anticipate in the second phase that you will be able to follow up in those areas with more objective data collection?
A couple ways to answer that question. A lot of it is perception data, but we are triangulating across multiple sources. So the more you see perception across larger groups and different groups of people, it becomes something that is maybe not exactly objective, but very relevant and important. And so we think about when we want to provide you all with findings and recommendations, we want them to be things that are resonating with the community, because you're most likely to see success when you implement a recommendation when it is addressing a finding that is largely perceived to be a problem, if that makes sense.
Not quite, but I can come back to that.
Okay. And then I'll add just to the second phase, and I don't know if Lindsay wants to say more about this, but the classroom observation data will be much more objective data that we're using some validated protocols to assess practices in the classrooms.
Sure. I will definitely come back to the perception data piece. You also talked quite a bit regarding response rates being higher for both parents and staff than in other places. What is typical?
10% parents for things like this, and staff would be around the 30%. It was consistent. I mean, this would be in an evaluation of this type where there are limited resources. In a pure research study where we're expending extensive resources to do follow-up, then it's going to be higher than that, but we didn't have the resources to do that kind of one-on-one follow-up.
Okay, thank you. And also, you talked about the data that you reviewed was from 2016 to 2018. Why that period? Is there some sort of relevance?
Again, that is the period of uninterrupted school years prior to COVID, wanting to make sure that we have we are collecting data from those school years where any recommendations that result from that would be relevant to regular programming.
I guess I think I was asking, why was it not longer? Maybe from 2010, 2000? It just, is this arbitrary? How do we come up with those years, or 3 years of data being what we look at?
Yeah, due to when we considered the scope of this project, we believed that 5 years would give us the amount of data that we needed to address the research questions.
Okay. On the report, which is very extensive, so thank you for that, on page 6, you talked about the parent survey. Did you also include parents who are no longer FCPS parents but had students during the years indicated?
No,
So all of the data's current parents?
correct.
Okay, thank you. Going through my things here. Page 9, you talked about timelines in terms of, okay, yes, here we are. You talked about timelines for testing and eligibility in the report, I believe, 9 and 10. Can you give a little bit more information in terms of what is meant by this delay in identification? Because some of the parent comments seem to be up until to the point I can get my child's support, but once the paperwork begins, then they're in compliance. So everything was pretty much the parent piece getting the support before official documentation started?
Yeah, I think that the parent, sort of the emerging theme around that parent concern was the input that it took to get to that point where you have officially initiated the eligibility testing and started that official timeline.
Because it says here lengthy timelines with testing. Those are all within boundaries. I mean, you have 60 days or 90 days depending on when you begin. So that's the piece that confused me a little bit.
And that's part of the challenge when we have conflicting data sources, right? So according to the compliance data, generally we're on time, but that comment was mostly from the open-ended response to the parent survey. So it could reflect a limited view from a certain group of parents.
Okay, moving a little bit into the discipline data, and I think Ms. Keys-Gamarra touched upon this a little bit. This is just so, it's so sad. That's what I wrote all over this document. Not that I am not expecting it, to be honest. I've seen this disproportionality a lot. But I guess my questions were, when you're comparing general education students to special education students, obviously there's more behavior, and you could actually point to why it is so. But I guess what I'm looking for is, why is it so within the special education group? I know you're not yet there with recommendations.
Can you clarify your question again? Why within?
The
why we're seeing that
disproportionality among
discrepancy?
special education students themselves, not as compared to the general education population.
So like between disability categories within the special education population?
No,
race.
between
Race.
Okay.
demographics.
I don't feel comfortable answering that right now. We would need to investigate further. It
Okay.
is unfortunately a common pattern we see in other places.
I have lots more questions. I'd like to go back, please.
Yes, ma'am, happy to put you on one. Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Ms. Tolan.
And I am lucky because I want to pick up on the discipline theme, because this is something that the prior board was very focused on. And so it would be very helpful to better understand and unpack that data. It related to that is, and I didn't see this in your report and I was neglected. Let me start with, your report is very good and I appreciate the work you're doing. Now, the second piece is the over or under identification of students for special ed services. I didn't see that captured at all. Were you planning on capturing it? Because as somebody who helped draft the forum topic, I was under the impression you were going to do that. Stop the clock, please.
I think we did look at that, and I want Lindsay to clarify, and I think we didn't see a strong enough pattern to note it as an emerging theme.
Yes, I would concur with that.
I would still make sure it's included in your
We can
report
certainly
since it was
share
part of
it.
the
Yep.
original request. Secondly, fidelity of implementation is always a problem in Fairfax County Public Schools, but it seems like it is a big problem here when it comes to ensuring that our students are in the least restrictive environment. And there's a linkage between having children in more restrictive environments and then exceeding the state and local norms for teacher ratio, because if they're not in a least restrictive environment, we require more teachers. And so I'd like to better understand the linkage between the two and what recommendations you have.
Is that for a response now, or, because that's certainly something I think we also noted and would like to investigate further.
Then I would like to see that investigated further, please. And similarly, along the fidelity of implementation, the prior board was very focused on the needs of twice exceptional students. And it actually is linked to the least restrictive environment. It's also linked to access and post-secondary school planning, because what the genesis of this is that if we don't provide robust training for our counselors and school-level staff, then we don't provide access to the opportunities. It's not intentional, it's just a lack of understanding of how to do that. So I'm wondering if you all are doing anything in that area and making recommendations on what we need to do.
Yes, that would be in the focus groups in year 2, definitely planning to conduct those with parents and educators of twice exceptional learners.
And I hope that those focus groups also will be multilingual.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, excellent, because that was my next question, is that they should be both multilingual as well as geographically dispersed.
Yes.
And going back to where I started, which was the big question over the discipline, did we look at the discipline data and see whether there were certain schools or certain regions that were more disproportionate than others?
We did not, but that's on our list for further disaggregating the data.
I would encourage you to do that because I think it's critical. And I would also encourage you to do the same with our post-secondary training or post-secondary planning and the least restrictive environment questions. We're a very large system, and oftentimes we have fidelity of implementation in certain places and not in others. And it really gets down to how do we honor the FCPS promise for every child in every school.
Thank you. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, would you like to go back as well?
I'm going to wait for the conversation.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
Okay. Ms. Tolan, followed by Ms. Marin.
Good morning. Thank you for the extensive report and the presentation. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing the next piece. A couple of questions. I'm happy to follow up Ms. Kara Corbett-Sanders' discussion on the 2E students. I'm very interested in seeing more information around the coordination of our 2E program. I know we have some, central office staff that work very hard on this and often get very involved in with individual families and students because we don't necessarily have the staff to take care of it at the schools, or people aren't trained. So I'm hoping that coordination can really be looked at, and maybe even look at what some other districts are doing around handling 2E students. One of the other things I wanted to ask about was the focus groups that you're planning in phase 2. Can you talk a little bit about how those will be put together, and how are you going to ensure that we are getting the full range of the types of parents that are involved in special education, and also the full range of our staff? I saw a notation perhaps that social workers were not included in the discussion in the first phase. How could we look at making sure that all of those staff people that do work with our special needs populations are included?
Absolutely. So I'll speak to the focus group planning for year 2. It's part of the reason we are very grateful to have the opportunity to get your feedback today, is because we want to make sure that we are planning for each of those areas in which we need to make sure there is representation on the focus groups. So yes, we are planning for focus groups to be representative of grade level, both for parents and staff, region, parents of students with a certain disability type, things of that nature, ensuring there's a multilingual perspective. So yes, that representativeness is something we are definitely planning for in year 2.
Yeah, and staff, the breadth of
Yes.
staff.
Just to clarify, I think the issue was that they received the survey, but we didn't unfortunately get responses from social workers. Is that right?
That's correct.
So I think that that's an indication to us that when we look at our sample for focus groups, we'll ensure that they're included.
Okay, what else? Oh, I was very interested in the data around, and the comments you had around professional development. Just on a broader look there, it sounded like in general, staff was okay with the professional development that was offered. You saw lots of courses offered. But then there seemed to be conflicting comments later on, with a little bit of a different view that there wasn't enough professional development. New staff didn't have the professional development that they really needed. So how will you look at the sort of the integration of all of that professional development that needs to have? I appreciated your comment about the retention and, the hiring of special education staff. That's a huge issue for us as, many districts. How will you kind of incorporate all of that together in your look at professional development?
I think the emerging theme from year one was around the robustness of the offerings. Now, does that mean the offerings are being accessed? Are they of high quality? Are they what teachers need right now? Are they what other types of instructional staff members need right now? I think that's the area of investigation in the focus groups in year two.
Okay, good. Okay, and just how that all fits together and helping us make sure staff can be retained and feel like they have what they need.
And I think that's exactly right. And then it's recognizing the multi-levels that are in play there. There is a central office component, there is a school level component, then there's the individual educator level component. So I think the focus groups are positioned to pick up on how the policies around professional development relate to the recruitment and retention, and how those policies have to transfer down from the district to the school to the individual.
And then just one other quick question. You reviewed 300 IEPs. How did you come up with that number, given that we have, over 27,400 students, with IEPs or in our special education program?
Part of it was management of the scope and the resources that we had. Conducting a review of IEPs for quality beyond just procedural compliance takes time. 300 we felt like was the minimum that we needed to ensure a representativeness among the sample, so that we could at least make sure that we're looking across disability types, ages, race, ethnicity, and so on.
All right, thank you. I'm going to leave my 6 seconds on the table.
Very generous, Ms. Tolan. Next, we have Ms. Marin, followed by Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation and the information that you put forth in the interim report. Just a few comments and then a question, and then a statement. I'm glad to see on slide 44 about MTSS. That's really important information to know, that we need our staff to understand that better. The transition support mentioned on slide 27, I agree with that. I would love to see transition actually happening more holistically for all students, particularly when they go from school to school. So that's another piece I'd love to see our staff working on. The concept on slide 22, it says that parents express concerns about the degree to which the policy, hold on a second, actually, scratch that. I have a question. Okay, so slide 20, it says that on the staff survey, 87.27% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that FCPS has effective processes for identifying students with disabilities. What did parents say about that? What did parents say about how effectively FCPS identifies students with disabilities? Did I miss that somewhere?
I would need to look on the survey for the question about the response rate for parents related to effective processes for identifying, but I can look that up in the.
Well, I think it'd be worth exploring, because when I look at slide 22 about the concerns of which the services and policy reflect needs and input, the comments I see about parents saying there's difficulty getting appropriate services, the timelines for testing and eligibility decisions. So it's interesting that staff overwhelmingly think that the division has an effective process for identifying students, but the parent feedback would suggest otherwise. And I think we need to clarify that. The last point I want to make is more for my colleagues and the superintendent, which is around slide 34. about novice teachers. So saying, finding that novice teachers, especially those who are not fully licensed, lack preparation and professional development, working with students with disabilities. And I'm going to assume, given the comments listed on that slide, you're talking about novice special education teachers, not gen ed teachers. But in hearing from constituents and myself being a parent of a child with an IEP, I would say that it's really critical that we advocate for teaching programs and licensure in the state to give gen ed teachers the training to identify students with disabilities, and for special education teachers to obviously be better prepared. So I would like to, at a future time, direct the superintendent that the school division make it a priority to conduct strong advocacy to the General Assembly to seek that Virginia teacher preparation programs and licensures contain the appropriate training for our educators. So I know the legislative agenda is, I think, in more of the October-November timeframe of work, but this is huge, and we cannot have children, faltering because we didn't identify them soon enough. I think we can do that, and we can advocate for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. Next, Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
I have no idea how to do this in 3 minutes. I have been a special ed parent for a long time. I've been advocating for a long time. I love when you said listen to parents. There's a historical and long-term knowledge that parents have that I think our staff could really benefit from. For example, FCPS has not failed Indicator 5 from 2018 to 2019. It has failed it from before 2010. I love this report. I could talk for days, as she knows. The big picture thing that I really want to focus on is you've got to disaggregate this data by program type. It is a huge thing that is missing here. It is the biggest thing that is missing here. Autism, for example, is across all programs, from 2E to honors classes to self-contained Cat B classes. There's nothing in here about programs and the realities of students within those programs. They vary significantly in our county. They vary from transition. They vary in terms of staffing ratios. They vary in terms of inclusive opportunities. You've got to look at how all these things intermingle. For example, transition. You got to break this stuff down elementary and secondary. It is hugely different. Staffing ratios and how staffing are used. Staffing ratios for inclusive settings at secondary, what are they? Because I don't think they exist, staffing ratios for inclusive settings. Staffing ratios for 2E students, you've got to look at the intersectionality of some of these things. Fidelity of implementation across all settings, but you've got to break it down. You talk about parent participation in IEP meaningful. Have we looked at whether there's a common understanding between staff and parents as to what meaningful participation needs to be? Because I promise you there's probably a different, parents don't know what they don't know. But the big picture I'm going to tell you is you've got to look, I want to see in year 2, if I don't see across programs and differences in programs, this is useless. I want some historical perspective. The Enhanced OP program, what happened to it at secondary? What happened to our staffing ratios? Have they ever been looked at? When have they been looked at? What's the reason for them? What do we have staffing ratios for inclusive settings? And what does that look like? What is the impact of staffing ratios for inclusive settings on our low staffing ratios? So that's my big picture thing, right? Like, you've also got to, in my opinion, when you're looking at transition, I'm so glad you flagged transition. You got to look at the silos in transition. How are counselors, CTS, and special education teachers working on those transition IEPs? And how well are those transition IEPs linked to the development of measurable goals and objectives that are then, and how's the data collected on that? Sit in one of those student interviews on those transition IEPs. It will blow your mind. Lots more. Thank you.
I'm going to assume that you want to go back, Ms. Sizemore.
Yes, I do.
All right, I've got Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Ms. Pekarsky.
Great, thank you. A couple questions first. This will be for Dr. Brabrand, what % of our budget is directed for special education students? And confirm that it's about 14% of our student population. And then I would like Ms. Coe to confirm the cost of this study. Stopping the clock, thank you.
I'm not sure, Mr. Smith. Do we know, is it about 14% of the budget? I don't have that figure in front of me.
Sort of 25.
You asked about the population?
Population and budget.
I don't have the budget information in front of me, but I can get that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the population's, sped population's 13%.
Yeah, it's a little under it's a little under 14. We'll get you the exact updated based on our
Budget, I mean, we're talking $500, $600 million. It's a substantial portion of our budget.
Yes.
So if I may address the cost of this review. So just a little bit of context, this is a 2-year review. And also AIR has kindly offered us a 3-month after summer of next year, like after we have completed the 2nd year, to help the stakeholders for 3 months to implement management action items at no cost. So the total cost of this review is $375,398. So we're talking about $376,000. Does it make sense?
Yes, thank you. And my colleagues, I said this really quickly because, again, 14% of the population, closing in on at least 20 to 25% of our annual budget, and then looking at $325,000 2-year consulting report, having 36 minutes to hear 3 minutes out of each other is not going to be sufficient. So I wanted to put a marker on the table that I think at some point we've got to think about a subcommittee, not to get in the way of our researchers, but we can't do this in the short amount of time today. So that was my 1 minute out of my 3 minutes. In terms of the study, I want to emphasize at the most macro level, one of the longest serving board members, almost 10 years now. My concern with the work you're doing so far is we have 200 schools. If you don't start to drill down where we're doing pockets of excellence to really applaud our staff, where at schools it's going at the best we could possibly hope for, to pockets of challenge, then this doing it at the macro level and just saying this is what FCPS is never going to drill down to really affect change where we need it to happen. So we have this with teacher retention issues school by school. Your model of going into 100 classrooms over 20 schools, please provide as a follow-up to this board how you're selecting those 100 classrooms, how you're selecting those 20 sites, because if it's not through survey data to find out where our pockets of challenge are, then you're not helping us, because you'll be going into schools where it could be going great. And we're not doing this because we're celebrating our work. We're trying to get better at what we do for every child in Fairfax County schools. So could you speak a little bit about this model you've proposed and what my concerns are, if they're valid or not?
I think what you're suggesting is different than what we planned. Our approach is to have it be as representative as possible, because we are trying to get that kind of 10,000-foot view and get the best, I guess, bang for our buck as we can in terms of, understanding what's happening in FCPS. So it's a random selection process where our goal is to be representative. I think what you're talking about is something different that we can certainly discuss afterwards, but we haven't planned to do it that way.
So, I have a master's in social work. I am not a researcher, but I will be going out to our community to understand if what you're proposing is really going to help us and help drive what Ms. Sizemore-Heiser said as a parent of a student with disabilities. I want to get to answers that help us. I really don't want to have a report that comes back and says, well, it was inconclusive, or well, it's good in some places and not in the other. We know that already. I don't need the study for that. So I do think construction-wise, Dr. Brabrand, I fully support your chief academic officer, Dr. Presidio, Dr. Boyd from Student Service or Special Services, to really get involved and make sure that with their expertise of knowing the needs of our system and working with the researchers to make sure that this is going to drive at $325,000 is an important investment, but if it's not going to yield the information we need, I would be worried. And my colleagues, I hope you'll think about maybe needing this working group of school board members on this beyond a speed dating work session.
Shall I list you for a go back, Ms. McLaughlin?
That's a second date.
Yes.
A second date.
Second date. I have Ms. Pekarsky, followed by Ms. Derenak Kofax.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for this report and for going through it so quickly. I'm not going to, reiterate what was just said, but my biggest takeaway was exactly what my colleagues said. We have such a large system, program types, regions. We need to have some idea of where the biggest needs are really concentrated so that we know what our next steps would be. So fully agree with all of that. Just some questions or comments. I'm glad you flagged the transition problems. That is huge. It's huge. Going through it and have gone through it as a parent, and I know this is a big concern. Are you also looking at transition issues between levels? So elementary going into middle school and long-term planning, is that part of, okay.
Yes,
okay.
absolutely.
So just not, okay, excellent, excellent. And I think Ms. Tolan brought up the professional development. While it's robust, ensuring that what we are offering is actually matched up with the needs that you are identifying and people are taking advantage, and there is an expectation that they will do that. I don't know if you've looked at this or thought about this, but our experience, my experience as a parent, and I've heard from many other parents, is that because of the increased workload, which you've noted, sometimes what happens is our special education teachers, which we know are best able to serve our students, are getting pulled out of classrooms to do some of that paperwork. And what happens is that those hours are being fulfilled with IAs, for example. Did you find that? I mean, are you looking into that? Because I would be very interested to see just how often this is happening. Because quality of delivery, I think, is an issue. So.
Yeah, none of our year one data collection activities specifically flagged that concern about IAs filling in 4 hours for special education teachers. But I think in year two, in the focus groups,
okay,
we certainly intend to have instructional assistants be a part of those, of course, special education teachers, and furthermore, specific focus groups to that topic of case management, workload, attrition and retention. What would it take to keep you, that type of thing. So I think year two is positioned to give us that kind of information.
Yeah, I'd be very interested because we need to make sure our, teachers are in the classroom as much as possible. You noted the ombudsman as an area of strength. I don't know, if we're utilizing our ombudsman in the way that would be most effective to get, people's needs met. So I just put that out there as something for you if you haven't already looked into that, just to note. Something else, and I think you're going to look at this when you're looking at least restrictive environment, and ability for our students to actually access some of these honors courses because they're not getting that special ed support. And oftentimes counselors are telling them, just had it happen to my child, you cannot take this, you don't have the support in there, and that's it. So it is a very common practice. So I just, want to put that out there. I'll take a go back. Thank you.
I'll write you down. Ms. Derenak Kofax, followed by Ms. Omesh.
Thank you all for this investigation, and it's comprehensive, and I see you also have that ability to do a phase two. But I want to say, as some of my colleagues have, since my tenure on the board for 10 years now, I have had 3 common concerns that have consistently come up. And it is the parents' concern about the degree to which they have their input. They don't always feel that their IEP reflects, and that came up. But that has been consistent. Like, people talk about historical data. Of course, mine is anecdotal from my tenure on the board, but that has been there. The 2 e-learners and their lack of rigor, their lack of ability to be supported for the need for rigor of education. And the IEP's lacking that individualized elements to it. So I think those are consistent with what you found in the time frame that you took. But I will tell you that I think that has been consistent throughout a problem that has plagued us through the years. And as I said, my tenure on the board is almost 11 years now. So I do have a couple questions, though. So 41% of your special ed learners are English language learners. Is that due, were you able to uncover any data that is due to us being able to bring these children up to grade level? Or is it when they enter our system, or are these real special educational needs? And I ask that because, you know, in my area, there were, we started pilot programs because we saw children coming to us at teenage levels with zero numeracy, zero literacy, things like that. But is it a special educational need, or is it just not us being able to bring kids when they enter our system up to a grade level? Or have you seen any evidence of that?
I'm happy to answer. I don't think we have enough evidence to answer that at this time, but the issue that you mentioned around, you know, is it a referral and eligibility issue, that came up as the theme. And so that's an indication to us that that's an area that we need to really push on in year 2 data collection.
Right, because, you know, we really haven't had a lot of robust reporting. I mean, I would say our ELL learners, we began pilot programs probably and then instituted across the board about 5 to 6 years ago, but we haven't had a comprehensive look at what that is. So I think that's really important with that subgroup. Quickly here, were you able to identify how many teachers you characterized? Did you have a number of as novice or not fully licensed?
I think we have something on the slide. Let me look.
Okay.
In 2020, FCPS employed 447 provisionally licensed special education teachers and 2,756 fully licensed special education teachers.
So still a significant number. I guess I'll ask staff this. Are we still having problems hiring fully licensed teachers?
Yes. And something that Ms. Marin said, Ms. Derenak-Kofax, you're spot on about your questions. We have to pursue licensure reform. Our labor market's changing. We're going to talk about bus drivers later this week. We're going to talk about the substitute pool, and our special education teachers were a national and state shortage before the pandemic. The system has to change. We have to have licensure reform, and we've got to find a way to let our great general education teachers have the skills and capacity to be with these special ed teachers. They're not going to go back and take 3 years of courses to meet state licensure requirements. We have expertise in the classroom with artificial barriers for some of those teachers to be able to work with those kids, and we've got to figure it out. So I look forward to additional conversation on this topic, Ms. Derenak-Kofax.
Yes, so, and 2 questions, try to get in before my time runs out. 87% strongly agreed that parents were satisfied. Do you consider this high? Do you consider this positive? And is this what you typically get when other parent surveys, if you noticed that? It was on page 31. I guess I'm out of time.
Don't feel like I can answer that.
I don't feel like I can answer specifically for other surveys because I don't have that in my head, but I would say generally like 85% or above, yeah, we would consider that high.
It's a good positive result. Okay. All right, put me on for a go back, please.
You got it. Ms. Omesh, followed by Mr. Frisch.
Thank you. Let me start by expressing some appreciation for some of the methodology that's been put in place. I know that, especially with the survey, considering outreach and the percentages of who we were able to capture is certainly heartening. I did want to echo a lot of what some of my colleagues have mentioned in terms of making sure that we disaggregate the data in ways that will be useful as we come back. So I wanted to kind of pause before I asked additional questions or did my own advocacy as to what you're thinking right now in potentially adjusting or areas you want to explore based on the feedback you've received so far.
Well, my key takeaway, and I have heard loudly and clearly, program type, school type, region. Generally, I think there is a lot more, particularly with the discipline data, to disaggregate by demographics, especially race. Allison, do you want to add to that list?
Staff, how staff are allocated to serve different regions, and schools that have different program types, disability types, and how that relates to the LRE data also by school, I think would be helpful as well.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how that fits with identifying focus, the 20 focus groups and then the additional steps. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Add on, but there's sort of two different types of activities. Well, classroom observations, put that aside. The focus groups is identifying specific topics. We want to get more at where we can't look at data to answer those questions. We need to get people to share their perspectives and their experiences. There's a whole nother set of analyses, though, that we're talking about, it just looking at the survey data at another kind of deeper level, disaggregating, and the extent data. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I just.
Yeah, so I guess part of phase one would be extended in that case,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Okay. In that case, I'm wondering if we perhaps process-wise would need a revisit, right, prior to, I feel based on the feedback that perhaps with phase two, fleshing out exactly what, what's going to happen or more details about that plan might be required, right, given where folks are at. And then maybe even with that second part of phase one of where we are, right, to get that kind of feedback and make sure people are on the same page. Trying to be constructive about process here. I think I support the comments made about collaboration being needed with staff so that ultimately we do end up in a successful place. Perhaps the next step would be, for you all to revisit with staff, to take this feedback in, and then we discuss again, the direction we want to move in. I'd hate for you to come back and report your findings and then everybody's upset that they're not, what we were hoping for. I did want to add a theme for consideration. I know with our special needs families, there's a lot of frustration around the advocacy and not feeling heard. I think part of that is what was touched upon where parent input's not reflected. Ultimately, they know their kids best. But even more structurally, maybe, if we can look into our concerns that are raised followed up on. I know that we have the assistant ombudsman to receive some of those concerns, but then what? Are we as a system responsive to that? I'd love to see that reflected in some of our investigation. And then I think, folks mentioned the staff shortage, so I won't harp on that, but that's another area that I certainly want to make sure we dig into since it wasn't articulated as a theme. I did have a question about what you did find related to that responsiveness piece. I don't know if, since it wasn't articulated as a theme, if that's something that you heard about, that you wanted to look into further.
Can you clarify that question, please?
Yeah, so we focused more so on how is special ed administered, et cetera, right? But when families come back and have concerns, are we responsive? Mm-hmm.
That is not something that in the phase one data collection we saw evidence to support. Yeah.
Okay. My final question is, what additional categories of data do you believe need to be captured?
I'm so sorry. You're out of time, but may I put you on a go back just for that since it's a whole new question?
Sure.
All right, Mr. Frisch?
Thank you. In the beginning of the presentation, you spoke a little bit about how we were gathering information from stakeholders and that the surveys were offered in 9 languages. Can you tell us a bit about that number in context? What was the range of responses in those 9 languages?
Yes, so that information is located in the appendix of the interim report. So we can refer you there. One moment, please.
I just want to be careful that we're not patting ourselves on the back for offering something in multiple languages and then seeing a much lower response rate. I imagine we are seeing a lower response rate.
Page 84 and 92 have the 2 tables with us.
Okay.
We would need to check the proportions, but whether the proportions of responses in those languages match the proportions of parents that speak those languages, and we don't have that available at this minute.
Okay. To that end, I think perhaps in the second iteration here, we can focus a bit on making sure that those numbers are reflective of the communities we serve. On slide 22, let me pull it up, unless we can pull it up on the screen. Thank you. Clearly, these are concerns that we all hear from our constituents. I'm curious what the prevalence of the feedback was in your conversations with stakeholders and with families. Like, at what point did it amount to enough to qualify as one of our areas of focus?
Yes, so I think that the primary data sources feeding into this emerging theme were from the surveys and certainly the open-ended responses there.
Mm-hmm.
So again, perception data, right? So this is something that we saw come across in both staff and parent surveys that we want to investigate further in year 2. And I think the focus groups are really going to be the avenue in which we can really drill down into the substantive nature of the issues.
And can you talk a little bit about what we can do with the focus groups to avoid self-selection of choosing people who, not that there's anything wrong with it, but come to the table with a predetermined objective, right? What about people who are not actively seeking to engage the school system?
Yes, in focus group participant selection, we are having extensive conversations, including with the Office of Research, about how we're going to ensure that those are random and representative to the greatest extent possible. So again, representative of parents and staff across multiple grade levels, region, language, parents of students of different disability categories, things of that nature.
Okay. The discipline data, while still horrible, is not surprising. I mean, we've seen this data before. I'm curious from staff if they could speak to, obviously we had to give a very specific data set to our researchers for them to conduct their work. But in the interim, many things have been done to try and ameliorate those problems. How much do you think the data would look differently if we were including more recent data from the last school year and the one before?
I think that's an excellent question. It's hard to kind of speculate, and I apologize. Dr. Boyd had to step away because she has to go present at the county board meeting. But I do think looking at the years prior to the pandemic makes the most sense for the context of this report, because things obviously were adjusted during the pandemic in some positive ways and in some negative ways that we would anticipate. We want to carry the positive things forward after the pandemic. But I think to do a fair comparison, the way that AIR has set this up to look at the pre-pandemic years really probably does make the most sense. And we'll continue to try to provide suggestions and feedback to the research team as well moving forward.
All right, I appreciate that. One final note, on slide 26, it talks a bit about the importance of focusing in on our English learners and our twice exceptionals. And it's numerous times throughout the research we're brought to the increased challenges of our English language learners, whether it's the disciplinary data, whether it's this area of focus. I think that's going to require some very targeted investments and focus in the next conversation.
Absolutely.
I'll give my 7 seconds back to the board.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and take my turn. Clearly you guys not only got school board members here, but you also got special ed parents. So we're coming at you, I think, with a lot of our own passionate advocacy that we have shared over the years, and for a lot of us, what made us run here. So you're right in the sweet spot of what we care an awful lot about. So I hope you will take our comments as constructive. And we're very excited about being on this journey with you. One of my biggest questions is why was ACSD not identified, our advisory committee for students with disabilities, as a key informant?
Maybe I can go ahead with that, but would love to hear the researchers about kind of the selection basis behind. We did receive extensive comments from ACSD, SAPTER, and also POIC in the beginning, and that is considered as part of the extant data. So I don't know, is it we have used that, and then we have the informant key focus group in year one focus on certain groups only, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we were dealing with having to kind of make some tough choices. We had a budget that only allowed for a certain number of people that we could include. We were considering doing 10 different individual interviews or try to group people together in focus groups. And because we had information from ACSD and other advocacy groups in a comment form, we chose that to have that as our input there. And then we chose to do focus groups with the other groups because we didn't have other means to get inputs from them.
Sure, I just want to caution that ACSD is not an advocacy group. It's the school board body as mandated by the state. So I guess since we didn't get them on the key informant, my advocacy to you all would certainly be this type of presentation and question and answer. And Esther, if it's outside of the scope of what we are paying for, then I think we need to have that conversation together as a board because this exact meeting needs to happen with ACSD. The other, I have so many, I'm concerned about the number of IEPs that were pulled. I think there's definitely been some conversations, at least in the community, that 400 to 600 is a sample size that they felt would be more appropriate for statistical significance. So can you speak to that a little bit for those of us not math whizzes?
We don't have information on statistical significance. I mean, if we were going to try to be statistically significant, what we were finding, I think it probably would be a lot more than 400 to 600, honestly. So we were just looking for a minimum to ensure that representativeness across different groups.
Is that something that as you go through, if you feel like you don't have a representative sample, that you might consider doing sort of an amendment to phase one and going back and looking at some more of these IEPs?
Well, it looks like Esther might say something, but I think we would consider anything. But
Yeah, so maybe I can also chime in on this topic. Of course, that we can expand the scope and amend the scope, but that may have additional compensation and, budget implications. So I just want to put that in place.
Sure, I would just argue to Ms. McLaughlin's point that if we're spending this money, we got to make sure, that we're doing it right. And sometimes this is part of the journey, right? Figuring out along the way what we can pick up. To that end, I am very concerned about how we're determining least restrictive environment unless you're going through IEP by IEP. How are you figuring out if kids are, placed in a center school and bused there, or are they in their neighborhood school? Another big point for me certainly is adapted curriculum. There's no VAP data in here, and I wondered why.
About adapted curriculum, what exactly about it? Can you clarify?
So we haven't aggregated by placement to determine what additional supports and services are needed for kids who are not on an SOL track, for kids who are on a VAP track.
Well, we have no data at this point of that subgroup because we did a staff survey and the parent survey. I don't think we disaggregated by that.
I would definitely say that's a big concern when you look at, disparate impacts. I think we have a whole group of people. My fear overall about this is that this is a one-size-fits-all special ed audit. And I think perhaps maybe going forward, maybe part of your recommendations are there are subgroups that we need to do a much deeper dive because it is night and day different from some of the things that have been raised here about 2E kids or others. I'm going to put myself on the go back as well because, good gracious, I didn't even get into my questions. For go backs, though, I'd like us to, we got time check here is about 25 minutes until we lose one of our folks here. So we're gonna try 2 minutes and see how far we get. And also, we're trying to stick to our time. So we'll have as a group some conversation if we don't get through these questions. And I do appreciate Ms. Omesha's feedback that I think we're probably gonna need another one of these as we get further along. First is Ms. Keys-Gamarra, followed by Dr. Anderson.
So I'm going to focus really on what our follow-up is. So Dr. Brabrand, because this area of special education is where students have, our documents show, experienced a greater learning loss, I'm wondering if, as we gather this information, whether we can look to use some of those ESSER funds to focus on the workload issues that have been mentioned, fidelity of implementation, improving IEP process and things of that nature. I am really concerned about how our community sees how we're responding, right? We get lots of reports and, you know, we don't have the communication. So I want to start there.
Yeah, a couple of things. Just a reminder, we communicated with every special education teacher in Fairfax County Public Schools before school started and extended time in their contract with the ESSER funds. So they did receive communication. We made a statement that we know the burden is above and beyond during this pandemic, in addition to all the paperwork. That is one of the themes our teachers are telling us. So we did that. That was our biggest chunk of ESSER fund dollars. So just. No problem. Yeah, and that you're brilliantly going to a second point that you made that I want to address. And we need to have this conversation this year with the board about professional development, about meeting time, about planning time. We have got to come up with a long-term solution. It's been a Band-Aid, and we've got to find the time if we're going to keep our teachers and want people to continue to work here. Our teachers want to do a good job. They need the time to be able to do it, and we have to figure out a systematic way to create more opportunity through the school calendar, through increased length of the school day for our teachers on their contract, or we need to put a lot on the table in front of you around that to really figure out how we can increase professional development time. Yes, we can do asynchronous, and we are doing that. We've used the technology, but some of the deepest learning that's going to change practice is that small group instruction with special ed teachers for them to be able to observe best practices and then to be able to go back and make sure they're doing those with fidelity in the classroom, and that takes time.
So I'm going to continue to advocate for a follow-up meeting to address the concerns that were raised here so that we can communicate with our, our students, our parents, as well as our staff. This is where we are. This is how we're responding. We can also talk to our audit folks as to how the team would be involved. So I put that as a next step. Basically, what I think we're dealing with here is what does the board expect, what does the community expect, and how does all of this impact how we're moving forward? So that should also be included in that next meeting. And then do we need to decide that there are additional steps in research needed is also what I wanted to mention, and I'll give you guys my 9 seconds.
I'll just say a question for the board out of here today, but I hear it being raised, so I assume the great Ms. Cohn will figure it out, is how do you want to do the follow-up as a whole, through the audit committee, through ACSD? I mean, where do you want to go? Because there is going to be more to do over this year, and you want to come back and have a product at the end of next year that meets what you want. So how to do that, what I can say to you right now is we'll partner with you in whichever way. If it's whole, we'll do whole. If it's through a smaller group, then we'll work with that dedicated group. And then I would make sure that we keep all board members in the loop with any updates as you all desire.
So I just asked for my 9 seconds back. I think we need to decide that perhaps today or a follow-up conversation, but also this has to be included in the communications plan, because otherwise we're going to start getting these letters, you didn't do X, Y, Z, and we need to.
Totally understand. I will
okay,
absolutely communicate to the community. After a decision's made today, we can put it in one of our updates to the entire community.
No, a plan. that we understand what is being communicated and we agree. I understand that you send your brand briefing, et cetera, but we need to be in on what is being said and have input in that. I know I'm over. Somebody else, please forgive me.
Nope, I appreciate you finishing your thought. All right, Dr. Anderson, and then I had Ms. Sizemore Heiser down, but now I see a few other folks, so I'll work on that while Dr. Anderson's talking.
All right, going back to the issue of professional development and teacher preparedness, obviously, teachers don't get all of their training at the schools. There's pre-service work. I wonder what consideration can be given for that to be explored. What are teachers graduating with in terms of special education? I know what it was like for me as a teacher. I'd like to think it has improved because I did not feel very prepared to do that work, particularly as a new AP, where you were in charge of SPED and you did not have that deep background. So I think that information is very important to ascertain. And Dr. Brabrand, you talked about a little bit in terms of revamping our approach around PD. Can you give us a little glimpse as to what you may be thinking about? Or not?
No, I'll just say candidly, I think as we continue to go through and looking at our school calendar that we talked to you about this summer and moving forward, we've got to find more time for professional development for our teachers. Because if we don't provide the time for training and then the follow-up and make sure, okay, you tried this, how did it go, what's working, based on observations, it's all time. We've got to find more planning time, and we've got to find more professional development time, both of those. I think the calendar is part of it, and I also think looking at the contract length like we just did for special education teachers is part of it. Thanks.
Okay, okay, thank you. I can't find the page in the thick report where you talked about how FCPS is kind of low in its area for inclusive practices. I'd like to hear your thinking in terms of how do the centers really impact that data? Or is that not part of it? Because obviously those kids who are in centers don't have any access to non-disabled peers for the most part.
Are you speaking specifically to LRE?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Page 24.
I mean, I don't know if this is where you were going, Lindsay, but the centers are technically, I think, would be considered self-contained classrooms, so that's the category that they would fall in with the LRE data.
Right, but having so many centers really does impact the opportunity for students. Again, I can't put my fingers on it, but you had other schools that did this. Oh, here it is. I think Montgomery was 14%, Prince William. I would love to have some correlation. Do they have similar centers or self-contained classrooms? Because that, right off the bat, that diminishes the opportunity for participation with non-disabled peers. Going back a little bit to what Mr. Frisch talked about, when you were pulling out the commentary, and this speaks back to my previous comment when I talked about perception data, when you're pulling out the information to determine what constitutes a theme, a trend, what threshold is being utilized? Does it show up once? Does it show up 5 times? Does it show up 20 times? I'd like to get a sense that it doesn't just show up once and then all of a sudden it's considered a trend or a theme.
Yes, so first and most importantly, themes corroborated through multiple data sources. So triangulating across, staff survey, parent survey, IEP review, key informant focus groups, really making sure that we have more than one data collection source from year one going into that. In terms of specifically open-ended comments, yes, it is perception data, and I think a lot of the quotes you see were pulled out to be illustrative of parent concerns, and want to stress that anything that's in there is intended to be an example of the type of parent comment or staff comment.
Okay, see, I've run out of time.
All right, I have Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Ms. Tolan. Did you want to go back as well? Nope. Okay, then followed by Ms. Marin.
I'll be very quick.
No, you're later in the queue.
I'll be very quick. The only comment I have is when you gave the list of things that you wanted to do going forward, loud and clear, we're concerned about fidelity of implementation at the local level of our policies and processes. So if you would please build that in. I didn't hear you say that.
Right.
Secondly, this board and the previous board worked very hard to ensure that we had a 2E handbook. That's part of that fidelity of implementation, because in that handbook, it talks about transitions. Third, the discipline goes back to the fidelity of implementation as well, because the previous board was very clear that we wanted to address those issues. And so I would just put that in. And then the last piece that did not get added to your list was the identification or over-identification of certain groups. This kind of builds on what Ms. Derenak-Kofax said, and it's also what I said earlier. And so those areas, please build them into what you're doing in phase 2, because that is how we will get real and meaningful input and be able to move the dial on these issues. Thank you.
Ms. Marin, followed by Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, you talked about the focus groups. How can community members express interest in participating in the focus groups? And will there be focus groups addressed by different disability category types, as was elevated by other members as a need?
So in terms of participant selection for focus groups, again, we talked about the idea that we've heard it's very important for that to be random and representative to the maximum extent possible. So I'm sort of curious what we can do to sort of accommodate that. What I've pretty clearly heard is a need to make sure that there's that representativeness, but also there are some targeted, purposive types of sampling we need to do, so.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think there's two types of focus groups. We talked a little bit before this about this, that there are the random representative. We want to identify certain groups, and we will randomly select, and if someone is not available, we go to the next person kind of thing. But we could also conduct a separate focus group that taps into the various advocacy groups in the county to select parents to focus just on input from those parents.
Well, thank you for the, off-the-cuff ideas, and I hope that we can work on that more. I think this role, ACSD, we've got to be sure that they're included. Again, as Ms. Cohn pointed, they are the board's advocacy, advisory committee rather, but they are, mandated by state. So I'm always, I just want to be sure that they have the appropriate seats at the table because they were selected for reasons that they have a lot to contribute. And then I'll just switch the focus to Dr. Brabrand. You mentioned about the time needed for teacher planning and professional development and the connectivity of that with the school calendar. So Dr. Brabrand, what is happening with the development of next year's school calendar?
Well, we've shared, Mr. Smith, I believe, has stepped away. I just shared with the board, I would think it was in the Brabrand briefing Friday, the calendar process that will have this board looking at a calendar for next year to review and vote on no later than January. And we're going to start an extensive community engagement process. So I don't have all of that in front of me, but we have a full timeline. We need to do an extensive engagement, and we need to put all the things on the table and then really work with the board to determine priorities for the coming calendar. There are a lot of priorities as we look at a calendar, and they're very, very difficult ones to balance, but we are going to have to prioritize as we look to next year's calendar. And I think in a way, one of the things we have to think about is the pandemic, though I don't like to say this and no one even wants to hear it anymore, right? I mean, the pandemic is staying with us longer than we had expected. And what are we going to do in a lot of our operations, including our calendar, to reflect that reality that the impact even on the pandemic is going to be with us longer than I think many of us expected, even when we approved that calendar last year as well. So lots to do, but interaction through the fall and a vote no later than January is our proposed timeline.
Thank you for refreshing my memory that it was in the Brabrand brief. So I think, to my board colleagues, in thinking about planning time, that's a policy and regulation that exists. So what's the role of the governance committee? And then calendar, there's some aspects of the public engagement committee. So what can we do to prepare for that discussion so we could really tackle it? I know planning time has been something I've been wanting us to tackle for quite a while. So I'm eager for that work. Thanks.
Just quickly, one thing, and again, I don't have Mr. Smith here, but Dr. Presidio is, I think planning time is one place we can talk about is looking at the budget, because the formula for planning time as provided several years ago by a prior board, is not covering the ability for elementary schools in particular to provide the planning time necessary for their elementary teachers per the regulation. So we were right at the cusp of finally arriving at that conclusion, and the pandemic hit, and we've got to return to it as one of our post-pandemic problems to come up with a solution for.
So now that's a third, board committee in the mix here. So I just ask the chair and vice chair to please consider how can we plan for that full board conversation or cross committees conversation, because January is like three months away. So how do we best prepare and prepare the budget and direct the superintendent to include in the budget something that will be acceptable? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you, and I appreciate your patience with my passion for this. A couple things I wanted to follow up on. First, Ms. McLaughlin, I'd be very much in favor of your idea of a working group, because there's obviously a lot of work here, so I'd be in favor of that. I'm in favor, I like Ms. Omesh's idea of an interim report or interim chance to talk to you as you do your work. So a couple things. First, as you're looking at IEPs, you need to look at the case management system that we have in FCPS, especially, again, elementary versus secondary. In terms of transition, IEP development, VAP, you've got to look at the VAP kids, as Ms. Cohen said, but especially in particular to transition, because our transition services are not available for kids who are not VAP kids. Once you get that STEM diploma, you can't get those post-secondary transition services, which also feeds into parent communication, because how many parents know about this in the transition planning, especially when they start at age 14, 15, 16, and they're planning their kids' high school years. If the kid needs to access that transition planning, do the parents know this? Are they able to determine the child's schedule in time to have access to that planning and still get the standard diploma? Super important to understand. When you're looking at focus groups, getting that broad representation, focus groups, site visits, IEP review, across program type, across age, across secondary. It's super, super important if you're going to really understand the realities of kids. So many things. When you're looking at IEPs, you've got to focus on the adequacy and accuracy of IEP goals and that handoff from the team that develops it to the team that implements it. There's a huge gap there in understanding. So how does that handoff affect this, that knowledge transfer? When you're looking at staffing formulas, I read in here that you were worried about overstaffing because of the 1 and the 16 number. You got to look at inclusion-based staffing formulas. And finally, when you're looking at LRE data, you're looking at 6 to 21. You've got to disaggregate it more than 6 to 21 in that LRE data. I'll stop.
All right, we have Ms. McLaughlin followed by Ms. Pekarsky. Quick time check that we have about 10 minutes until we lose one of our researchers. And so you have to leave, but can you stay while we finish? There's about 5 of us, okay? And is that suitable to the board that we finish this with everybody having 2 minutes? We've got 5 people left. We'll take a quick break and then transition to ERFC. Perfect. All right, Ms. McLaughlin.
One, I want to absolutely give voice to ACSD. It is state mandated. It is some of our most expert parents and advocates and people in the profession. So figure out a way to incorporate them sooner rather than later. Number 2, certainly understand if we have to expand the scope at $375 price tag, okay, figure out whatever else that's going to require. The other thing is I'm very mindful that we purposely did this through the Office of the Auditor General. Having family members who are university researchers, I greatly appreciate the importance of doing this work with integrity, and I know that's what you want to be doing for us. But we really need to make sure we draw upon all of the stakeholder experts. That includes the superintendent's team who know the system inside and out. I absolutely would say that once you get their input, if anything gives you pause, that you feel like that's going to take you in a direction where you can't be independent enough, that's the beauty of our Office of the Auditor General. You're not going to the superintendent, you're coming to Esther Coe. And she should absolutely be coming to the full board and let us know if there's maybe a disconnect and how you want to proceed with phase 2. I do think that we're all in this as a partnership, but we've got to get this right. I think you can appreciate the pressure on elected board members. $375,000, we need to have something to show for it that the community is going to respect and find as substantive. And then, the only other thing I would ask again is if your survey data didn't include getting the schools, like the actual schools that these families who responded from, where they were from, or staff, we need to figure out how to get that, because if you cannot help us figure out among our 200 schools where these problems are occurring, then again, I worry that we're not going to effectively target and address the problems where our families are counting on us. And my time is up.
Well done. Ms. Pekarsky, followed by Ms. Derenak-Kovacs.
Thank you. So, I mean, at the end of the day, what we care about is outcomes and where are these kids ending up and how are they able to access opportunities. So I'm very interested in phase 2, what we are going to look at and kind of really dive into data around certificates versus, full diploma versus post-secondary work, and really breaking all that data out so we have a better understanding of where our kids are ending up, and including from what programs, outcomes. I mean, that's what I'm really, really interested in, and how did going through the system and these different programs versus their different disability types have an impact on that. I think that is very useful for what we're trying to do here at the end of the day. So I'm looking forward to that. This has been brought up, but I am concerned with the 300 number. I just am. It's a big system, and there are varying experiences. So I don't know if that means we have to have the conversation about adding more, as was brought up, but that concerns me greatly. Will there be students in the focus groups for phase 2?
That is something we are willing to consider, with the caveat that our IRB, our Institutional Review Board, what allows us to conduct the research, we are not approved to conduct focus groups with minor children right now. But a way that I could potentially, and this is off the cuff, see this working is, I've heard transition loudly and clearly from multiple board members. We could speak with students who are over the age of 18 about transition issues, their experiences, et cetera.
And the students will be part of the classroom observations, right? So that if, for the minor, if because of some procedural challenges, because I think application through the IRB is not like just turnkey, it's a process, right? So we definitely will keep the students involved in the student observation, because they are, the prime, the observations that they are doing. But we can talk with the board about like expanding, the IEP. I think Ms. Pekarsky, you mentioned about that, but then there will be a cost implication that we can talk about that.
I would just put it out there that we need to consider that. I mean, our students are really the ones who have gone through this experience, and I think could provide valuable information to help inform impact and I think, again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do, which is outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks for leaving it on the table. Ms. Derenak-Kovacs, followed by Ms. Omesh.
Thank you, and I think you're beginning to hear some consistency in what enhancements to phase 2 we need. I am also, concerned about the sample size, that it will not allow us to uncover what we called our pockets of excellence versus our pockets of challenges. So I think that's important, and that's also, as another colleague put it, fidelity of implementation of our program. So that's extremely important to all of us, and if we can find a cost-effective way to do that, I would appreciate that. I will just chime in because she just spoke, Ms. Pekarsky. I think if we can get some students, that would be wonderful. And then finally, I would like, again, a deeper dive on our EL learners and the identification process. As I spoke to before, if you have any further questions, I can go deeper into that. I probably don't have the time right now. Are they on grade level? Is general ed robust enough to get them on grade level in a timely manner? Is the identification process being skewed because that's not happening in our general ed population? That, in a nutshell, is what I'm thinking. All right, thank you so much.
All right, so just to build on some of the additional components, hopefully that we can come back and revisit. I do still think that we need a wider breadth of the time frame. I know some people mentioned in the look back piece, but even despite COVID, I mean, things have changed in terms of what's expected. The shortage looks different. You know, to stop at 2018, I'm still really concerned about. So if we can even look into some of the more recent stuff that's going to be informing what we're walking into, albeit understanding that there's a caveat there with the COVID situation, I would advocate that we still need to do that. So it looks like, actually, and I have a question. In what ways have you found existing data, so especially in looking into the extant data that we have, limiting and informing our division on a regular basis about these things? So we've all raised, I'm curious to hear what you independently found as well.
I don't know if I can answer that question right now. I mean, I would say looking more closely at data by program and school is important. We haven't dug into it enough to know that if I assume we're able to do that, but there may be a limitation there, and that would be important for you all to be able to look at the data that way as well.
Yeah, sorry, I don't just mean in what you've collected or your work, you know, but in your examination of what's available, what's not, what we collect, have you found anything to be limiting in terms of informing us as a division?
No, I can't say that I have. Everything that we have asked for, FCPS has been incredibly cooperative and helpful in connecting us with that. Everything we have asked for on the wish list has been provided.
Okay, yeah, I would just urge to even think about, not to think that staff wasn't cooperative. I mean more so as a division, what we could be looking into and collecting to inform how we're serving our students. So now we're at a place where I think we need a small team on this. I would see that maybe we need some LT members, ACSD members, school board members in a small working group, informing you all and working with you all in the meantime to have that check-in in the long term. I think in that check-in, ideally, we would include the communications piece. Maybe staff can come back with that communications plan at that time, and we can look into how that's going to be disseminated to the community. And then after that, I'm curious as to what happens after phase 2. So if you can speak to that just a little bit, the analysis piece, recommendations. Yeah, go ahead.
So maybe I can talk about, since this is like the scope of work, right, that we agreed with the researchers. This is a fixed contract, so they are helping us on some set, objective to achieve. And then if I hear correctly, like talking about the implementation and what happened after the year 2 report is released, that they are working with us at no cost for 3 more months, and then afterwards that the contract is done. So of course the board can choose to have an amendment, or we can go to the market for an open competition to find another vendor to support, but depending on what do we need, right? At this point, if I can say that is AIR job is to uncover the challenges, the areas of concerns for us. And this is phase 1, if I just use my own terminology. And based upon that, the school board, collective school board can determine based upon that, what else needs to be done, what needs to be focused on. And that would be different than what we have signed up or AIR has signed up for.
So
does that make sense?
Recommendations wasn't a part of that?
Recommendations is, but implementation is not. I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood. So thank you for your clarification. Yeah, it will be part of it, and they will be also working with stakeholders, meaning management and school board if necessary, to implement those recommendations for 3 months.
Right, I think after that check-in we have on the phase 1 and 2 parts, we might need then that collaboration between staff and the researchers to identify recommendations with cost items, with a plan of how we're going to incorporate it so that we can move forward. But thank you all.
Thank you.
And Ms. Omage, I just wanted to your point, because we want to be so careful about preserving this as an independent audit. Since you were the head of audit, do you mind just speaking to where you see the role that's appropriate? This is not my time, by the way.
Really quickly, I appreciate the follow-up. I think that's something in phases, but I think we do have to be very careful of protecting the integrity of this study and the way that the audit committee is managing this, which is what the board approved. So I do think that we can have those meetings within the study with their guidance, but we also want to make sure that the community can respect what comes out of it. And so therefore, I would urge us to just be careful with this structure.
And just really quickly, I still want to take my turn, and then what I'd like to do is have us come back real quickly after my turn, and let's figure out a next step, because I don't want to leave it. I agree with all of you. Let's not just leave this hanging. So we'll put a couple of minutes on the clock to do that. My questions, I know that we lost one of our folks, and I do so appreciate your time and your patience. With the other staff who responded as part of that other staff?
I don't know. I can't answer that right now. It's probably in an open-ended response, but it's not in the report. Like, people wrote their roles down, so, but we can find that out.
Okay. I just want to make sure that ATS was a part of that, since it overlaps and intertwines with so many different disabilities and so much of what we do, and it's been a consistent communication from parents as a really big deficit. So I want to be sure that ATS is represented in when we're talking about this. I'm sorry, assistive technology. My apologies. And then also, just in our communicating out, I know I beat a dead horse here, but especially when we're talking about over-identification of our ELL kids, I really, I really want us, it's no worries. I just want us to be sure that we're not only utilizing written communication. So again, working with Helen and OCCR on what are our strategies that we're using to either communicate this via parent liaison, using phone calls, using video messaging. I just want to be sure that we are not just using written communication in trying to get folks to come to these focus groups. So that's not on you, that's our job here.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
Thumbs up from Helen. And then I just reiterating what my colleagues have said, I'm concerned about the grouping where we have the 3 through 5. We wind up accidentally capturing kindergarten in the experience of preschool, which is just so markedly different and not yet mandated. So I just want us to be really careful about, like, how do we, again, disaggregate preschool experience, which is super important and super important to know what's going on, but then that K through 6 and then potentially 7 through 12, although Mason District, yes, ma'am, always trying to be inclusive of that. Okay, those were the end of my questions, and so I'm going to turn it back over. Ms. McLaughlin had a point that she wanted to make, and let's make Ms. Coe wanted to speak first. Yes, ma'am.
It's okay, because maybe you can help answer. So, as I noted in my earlier remarks, I completely understand the integrity of an audit and this process. However, I know that there's something called a contract and a scope of work, and then how the scope of work gets implemented, and then also in a phased approach, have we identified aspects of the scope of work that we didn't know were essential and needed to get done? So that's the part that I want to really differentiate here, is we're sitting here with 12 elected board members. If we're bringing to the researchers who don't know our system the way many of us do, and saying, in your scope of work, what you thought, and what we identified initially is what we need, the implementation of that scope of work may need some refinement. And we've talked about all that today. So I would like to hear from our researchers and from you as our OAG, is that then still maintaining the independence of the audit, not changing necessarily the scope of the work, although we need the implementation to expand a little bit more, and that's going to add some time and cost. But I don't want to have some confusion here that we're suddenly wanting to change the course or make this go in a way that's not independent. But if it's not implemented well, the scope of the work can be the scope of the work, and it's still not going to give us what we needed and expected. Did I make that clear?
May I go first, and then Allison, please help. So I think we all took a lot of notes from this meeting, and I think this is a very good forum to really exchange ideas, right? I mean, we want to make sure at the end of year 2, the final report that exceeded the expectation of the school board. So I have heard loud and clear that fidelity of implementation, we know, everyone knows that this is big. We heard about the disaggregation of data and analysis. And I think this too can be ingrained as part of the scope of work for year 2, because we are going to do classroom observation, we're going to do focus group, we are going to further look at the extant data. When I say we, I'm more referring to our researchers, to look at that. and also how to involve ACSD, because they really have all the expertise and experience in the field. So that totally, to me, that can be done within the scope of the existing contract, right? This is a fixed contract, and me as an auditor, that's what we have to preserve. And the second piece, and thank you so much, Megan, for raising that, is that throughout the first year, we have been really very collaborate, with management. We know that that is key. It's a two-way street. And at the same time, we are preserving the independence and objectivity of this review, right? So at the end of the day, that when the community members looked at it, they have to trust in what we identify are the facts and what they are concerned about. So I think that with my office being kind of the conduit, being kind of the liaison, it really helps that. And throughout the first year, I don't think we have experienced any challenges of lacking of the independence. While we are getting full management support, but they are not, saying that we cannot put certain things out. No, we have never get that. So I just want to say that in front of a public meeting so that community members fully aware. And in terms of preserving the independence, I will be working very closely. I think that's my 3 minutes. Working very closely with Allison and team, and to discuss after this meeting to see if they have any concerns or anything I need to channel back to the school board. But that's really front and center. And at the same time, last year, we have been working very closely in the audit committee, right, to provide update to the audit committee members. So I don't know if Tammy, serving as our audit chair this year, anything else you would like to add on to that. But my sincere suggestion is that as part of the communication, I will keep the audit committee up to date about where we are regularly.
And Ms. Coe, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I think the question for the researchers was, are there pieces of the project that don't feel like we were able to capture in the current scope based on what we've heard today that would require a change? Is that what you're asking?
I think things that we were talking about, getting more of that school level fidelity of implementation data and really making sure you're able to zero in with 200 schools. Where are our challenges, not just having it so global that we can't apply it to where the problems are.
Yeah, I think that would require a change in scope, which we're certainly open to talking about. We could do something like more purposeful sampling of classrooms and types of schools and programs to go in and observe. We also need to do some thinking of our specific observation protocol. Right now, we have a more generic observation protocol to apply to all schools, but depending on the population and the needs of those schools, we might want to look at it differently. So those are all things that would require relooking at the scope.
Yeah, and again, I'm not talking about like our special education centers. I'm talking across our general ed school sites that across the board, we've heard some are handling it great, some having challenges.
And we could identify sites using a statistical analysis, those that are kind of doing much lower than what you would predict, versus you could also identify those pockets of excellence you talked about, doing like a beating the odds analysis. But that's a whole different analysis that we hadn't put in our scope.
So, Ms. Coe, then to Ms. McLaughlin's point, do you see the next step as speaking with the researchers, figuring out what would require board input or approval, in terms of maybe changing some of the scope here? Do you see that as the next step and communicating that to the full board in one of your messages? What do you see, as the next step?
So definitely collaboration further with researchers are key, because we did get a lot of good information from this meeting. And afterwards, I'm wondering, when we come up with a proposed plan, should the first forum be going to the audit committee? Then that it provides a forum to discuss. But Tammy, what's your thought about that?
I would see that as the protocol that is the right way, so we could have the first brush at it, and then we could bring it to the full board as we do with our other committees.
And all board members can go to any committee meeting.
Exactly.
All right, can I just see, just quickly, show of hands, consensus, everybody agrees that next steps in the process are that Ms. Coe and researchers will work together to kind of reformulate where we need to go, and then we'll use the audit committee as the mechanism to then come back. Perfect, excellent. All right. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience. I know that some of us communicated individually, but this was the first opportunity for everybody to hear what everyone else is thinking. I know we threw a lot at you, so thank you very much for that. And we're very, obviously, very excited and very invested in where this goes, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to come.
Thank you. All right, to my colleagues, I know everybody could probably use 5 minutes. Our wonderful ERFC folks have been sitting over here. So, what? When do we eat? I know. Well, we eat after ERFC. So 5 minutes, everybody back here at 12:20 on the nose, and we will look forward to our ERFC presentation.
All right, let's get back to the table, everybody. If everybody could, sometimes I feel like we need a mallet. All right, we're going to get started, everybody. Our next topic is the ERFC annual report. Before we dive in there, if we could minimize outside conversations at the table. I want to remind people that everybody received in their inbox this morning a link to the next steps document, the Google Sheet, to include their next steps like we've been doing in previous work sessions. So please post your next steps there. We will now dive in on the ERFC annual report. Mr. Martinez? Would you mind turning your mic on?
Thank you for that. Well, thank you again, FCPS School Board. It's great to be here. My name is Eli Martinez, and I'm the Executive Director and Chief Investment Officer at ERFC. I'd like to maybe start off by introducing the members of my team that are here with me today, starting with Missy O'Neill, who's our Operations and Communications Coordinator, Michael Lunter, who's our Finance Coordinator, and then Jamia Conlas, who's our Investment Specialist. So obviously, we're all happy to be here once again. And as a reminder, this report is an update from last year on the health and status of the ERFC defined benefit pension plan. We're not asking for any action from this board at all. It's simply an update. So first and foremost, as an agenda, the first thing I want to lead off with is that I'm going to try to summarize the entire presentation in one slide. So you're going to have the key takeaways in one slide, and you should understand the nature of the presentation after that. We'll also talk about where the money comes from to pay for the benefits of the plan itself, and then also the plan dynamics, how they're split up in terms of membership. We'll talk about the financial strength, how we're doing versus our peers, how our performance has done, what we've done to mitigate the costs of ERFC as an organization, some of the initiatives that we've undertaken to help with our members, raise awareness, so on. And then we'll summarize and then open up for questions. So with that, as I said, in the next slide, I'll try to summarize the key takeaways for the entire deck. And to start off, the one thing you should know is that the only plan that's open to new membership where all new employees go into is the 2001 Tier 2 plan. This is significant because it's also the least expensive plan for you as an organization. And what that means is that over time, as individuals, employees from FCPS that are part of this plan start to retire from that, it'll drive down the normal cost of your pension plan. Now, we'll talk about what normal cost means in later slides, but for now, know that it's the least expensive plan. You should also know that the plan has performed very well over the last 10 years, averaging 7.6%. Our target is 7.25%. We've increased our funded status from last year by over 2%. And lastly, we remain competitive versus our peers, and we're always looking for opportunities to improve on that as well. So next, let's move on to how the plan is funded, and starting with where the money comes from to fund the plan itself. And so to start off, obviously, most of this information is going to be June 30th to 2020. It's somewhat dated, and that's because we needed a reference point that's audited numbers that we can check against other pension plans that also have publicly available information we can compare it to. So that's why you'll see that it's either going to be June 30th of 2020 or December 31st of 2020. I'll indicate where that deviates as well. But as you can see on this first slide, 19% of the money that it takes to fund the benefits of ERFC comes from members. And that doesn't mean, just to be clear, that doesn't mean that we're taking 19% of members' paychecks every month. That means that as a whole, when we add up all the members' contribution, it adds up to 19% of what it takes to fund the benefit that they'll receive once they retire. In addition, I really like this slide because it lets us compare and contrast where the employer really, what FCPS, what you're doing as an organization for your members. And you can see here that you're contributing roughly twice as much as the members are contributing. So that's very significant, obviously, because you can look at this a couple different ways. One way I like to look at it is if an employee wanted to replicate this in a self-directed 401k or 403b or 457, they would have to find one of those plans that doubled or matched their contribution by twice of what they're putting in. Those are rare in the corporate sector and even more rare in the private sector. So this is a significant benefit to your members. The other thing you can look at is where the rest of this money is coming from is the investment growth. So the investments are making up 41% of the money that it takes to fund this benefit, and that number fluctuates over time. You'll see how that happens. But this is also significant because this allows the member to be participating in a plan that not only doubles their contribution by virtue of your contribution to them, but also have the benefit of professional money management that averages more than potentially the average person can actually afford to do on their own. So in the next slide, I think I want to look at this slightly different. It's the same information, so I'll go through it very quickly. We're looking at this as dollars out of $100. So for every $100 that's put into the plan, 19 of those dollars comes from employees. 40 of those dollars comes from FCPS, and then 41 comes from investments. And this is where I said, look, that last slice, that $41, that fluctuates over time depending on the market. I can tell you just as an update looking at the performance this year that for next year when we report to you that that $41 will turn to $83. So we've had a very significant year at ERFC. So, but what does this maybe translate to in terms of the plans that we oversee for our members? And I'll go through this very quickly because you're very familiar, I think, with this information. You have 3 plans. I mentioned earlier that the only plan that's actually open is that 2001 Tier 2 plan. The numbers in green, those are the members who have retired from the plan already. The numbers in blue, those are the ones that are actively working for FCPS. And as you can see, the legacy plan, which was established in 1973, actually still has members working for you today. Those are retiring as we move along, but they're still active members in that plan. The majority of the 2001 Tier 1 plan members are actively working. There's a small population that has retired. It's somewhat of an anomaly, really. We really look at these employees as employees who have come to FCPS with prior savings, potentially prior work experience, maybe many years of experience. So perhaps they come to work for FCPS maybe at the end of their career, maybe work for 5 years and then decide to retire along and match what they get from FCPS with other retirement savings. So. And as you can see, as a last point here, the 2001 Tier 1 plan doesn't have any retirements out of it, and that's obviously because it's a very young plan. We require a 5-year vesting period, and so nobody's vested in that plan as of yet. So looking at a projection, and this is only looking at the legacy plan and the 2001 Tier 1 plan, the legacy plan in blue and the Tier 1 plan in green, and what you're seeing here is the retirements on an annual basis over the last 10 years. The key takeaway here is that by 2028, there's going to be more green than blue. So there's going to be more 2001 Tier 1 members retiring from ERFC by 2028. Why does that matter for you? Because by 2028, if that's the case, that you're going to have a lower cost, a normal cost to pay for contribution rates for the plan itself. So maybe pivoting a little bit to the sustainability of the plan, and maybe just to look at the next slide very quickly and saying that I'm very comfortable in stating that ERFC is sustainable in perpetuity. And I can say that because we have a 49-year track record now of meeting our assumptions over time. That's not something that's easy to do, but we've managed to do that. And FCPS, I think, has also shown commitment to the fund. You've funded ERFC year after year for 49 years, so we feel like it is a very sustainable plan. I also want to compare versus other plans. I know we're always curious about FCPS and how we compare, or FSERS, excuse me, and how we compare against FSERS. And then it's important to understand that as you see this number, this is our performance, 4.7% as of the end of June 30th of 2020. Now, let's think about what was happening in 2020. We all know what happened. It was a very rough year. I don't think any of us are going to forget that year anytime soon. But, the pandemic hit, and it was the worst 3-month period since the Great Depression. And so what I can tell you is that 4.7%, as we compare to peers, was at the top 5 percentile of our peer group. Not only that, if you compare ourselves to how FSERS did, obviously they had a rough year, and then as a whole, their performance versus ours was not as good. So we had, relatively speaking, we were able to protect on the downside. We protected the money. We performed at 4.7. We performed very well for that year. So again, there's our fiscal year performance after fees, 4.7%. Over the long term, 7.6%. And then in addition, I think we want to maybe fast forward 6 months so you can get an idea of, just even a 6-month period, what a difference it makes. So as of December 31st, 2020, we were at 13.6% return after fees, and still our long-term average after 10 years, 7.6%. Again, we only have to make 7.25 on average. Now, I want to maybe deviate a little bit here from the deck and just give you an update as of today, because it's important to also think about what the market has done just even the 6 months after December 31st of 2020. And the market has really rallied, and we've participated significantly in that as well. Our performance as of the end of this year is 26.8%. So we've performed very, very well. So now let's look at maybe our funded ratio. I want to maybe switch over to actuarial terminology. And as I maybe show you these numbers, just think about this and, try to forget the actuarial language, because really only actuaries understand it. But think of what I'm going to show you as what we have in assets divided by what we owe to our members for services performed. That's all this is. And so this is data coming out of a national database that tracks public pension plans. And that's the average funded ratio for public pension plans. When we overlay ERFCs over the last 10 years, you can see that ERFC has come above the national average year after year for the last 10 years. And you can see that in 2020, that spread has increased as well. Looking at the next slide, and maybe just to introduce a fairly familiar concept and the way we can think about the unfunded liability, I want to maybe draw on something that we're all familiar with, our own mortgage. And when we think of our own mortgage, there's nothing that really is bad about a no mortgage. We all need a place to live, and as long as we make our payments on time, there's no issues with that. So think about what I'm going to show you as a mortgage, an investment in the members. So this is what we owe for past service, the last 10 years over time. It's easy to look at this data and assume that it goes up and up and up and up, but as you can see in 2020, it's come down. We expect in 2021, it's going to come down even more given our performance. So this is also interesting when you overlay our funded ratio on that mortgage balance, because you can see that our funded ratio shows that our balance has been fairly stable over time. This is significant for you as an organization, because this means that you can forecast the cost of the plan a lot better, and not all plans can do that. We've fluctuated between 74 and 77.7% over the last 10 years. So it's been very stable. Looking at maybe the next thing you might be asking is when are we going to get to 100% funded? It doesn't look like we're going to get there, but we will. You've already taken measures on your end, and one of the things I've already introduced is the mortgage payment. Another thing that you might be familiar with is homeowners association payment. So think of the normal cost as an HOA payment. As some of you know, even if you pay off your mortgage, you're still going to have an HOA payment. The HOA payment, can go up or down depending on what the HOA committee does. But your HOA payment is slated to come down as members of the Tier 1 and Tier 2 plans start to retire. The Tier 2 plan is obviously very young. We don't have retirements now. We're expecting to have retirements maybe 20 to 25 years from now, but it's going to come down. And then we expect that over time, your funded status will increase. And then by the time we hit 2040, that you're going to be 100% funded. Looking at maybe the contribution rates and what they've done over the last 10 years, I think the important takeaway here is that last year, your rate went up, and it's going to stay at 6.7% over the next 2 years. So this fiscal year, you've already absorbed that 6.7. Next year, it's going to stay at 6.7 as well. And you can see there the employee contribution rate fixed at 3%. Know that the employee contribution rate is something that this governing body controls. So we basically give you the outcome for the performance of the plan and any changes that have been made by the school board, and that really equates to that contribution rate. But that's what I want to talk about next, is where that change comes from. Where does why does it increase? Where is it coming from? So this slide is just to talk about how to read this. As you see the images come up, there's not a sense of magnitude comparison. This is just relative to each other. One is more than the other. So it's in order of left to right. The one that's up now first is having more people as part of the plan. You've hired more people as an organization over the last few years. That has a cost. They are participating in the ERFC pension plan, so they cost more money to fund the benefit. That impacts the contribution rate. The next thing, in terms of a greater impact than more people, was pay increases. So as you've increased pay for your employees, that also has an impact on the cost for the contribution rates. And then the market ups and downs, which we don't control, obviously, those are things that increase and impact the contribution rate. And then lastly, the time factor, and this is sort of a tricky factor because as you think of a mortgage, most of us have a fixed rate mortgage. When we make changes to that mortgage, any years after the documents have already been signed, and let's say you decide to build a new room, to remodel your home, think of that as adding more people and adding pay raises. So as those things happen, the less amount of time we have to pay this off. So right now our goal is 2040. We have about 20 years to pay this off. And you remodel another room, that factors into the contribution rate impact. So, and it's going to have a higher impact as the less years that you have left. So a pay increase today will have less of an impact than a pay increase 5 years from now, because you'll have less time to pay that off. So how do we mitigate costs? And then just talking about what we've done as an organization to be responsible stewards of the pension plan. So we've also significantly reduced the cost for money manager fees over time. We're slated to reduce this by $40 million over the next 10 years. That's really the same as in today's dollars, walking into ERFC, depositing a $25 million check and seeing it grow at 7.25%. We're also focused on continuously improving our operations, looking at efficiency and quality of service. We want to participate in the Virginia SPQA, which is Senate Productivity and Quality Award. We're right in the middle of that. We've made some progress, and that's going to give us significant notoriety as a pension plan. This also has an impact financially. We're looking at, over the next 10 years, saving at least $2.5 million in operational savings. So now to pivot once again and just to talk to you about some of the things that we're doing on behalf of our members, and really to help you out as an organization to make raise awareness on several fronts. We've started to leverage our members as testimonials, looking at them. If you look at our website today, you'll see a great testimonial right on the front page. I encourage you to look at that from an SCPS employee. And it's just been received very, very well. And we're also looking at revamping our forms as an organization. We understand that Retirement is a very complex issue, sometimes intimidating, so we want to make it as easy as possible for people to get through retirement. We've added a lot of videos as resources for employees. You can go on MyPDE right now and look at a lot of resources that are ERFC related that members can access at any point they want. And then lastly, we've been working closely with FCPS recruitment and trying to understand what your needs are. And just understanding that the ERFC plan is a competitive advantage for you. And I just couldn't help but overhear some of the discussion earlier in terms of, teachers and that they're a scarce resource. And really you're competing with everybody around you, and this is something that not everybody has. And I'll be honest, and even folks that have it, it's not the same. So this is definitely a competitive advantage. We're working with the recruitment team to make sure that the word gets out and to formulate a message that works for everybody. So next, I think some of you might be familiar with this program. We have an ambassador program. It started in 2016 with 14 people. These are people that, employees that are volunteers that distribute basic information about ERFC and really guide people to us in terms of getting questions answered. Over the years, this has grown to 180 members. We were shooting for 200 by the end of last year. We all know COVID happened. That put a speed bump in our plans, but we're back on track. And this is, as of January 2018, we've still managed to grow a significant number of that ambassador program, and we're looking for ways to continue taking advantage of our own employee base to raise awareness as well. So lastly, just to recap, just so we understand the key points again, the 2001 Tier 2 plan is the only plan that's open, that's growing. It also happens to be the plan that is least expensive for FCPS in the long run. We've performed well versus our peers. Our funded ratio is stable. Our costs are relatively low, and then our awareness is growing. So with that, I'll open up for questions or comments.
Thank you. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, followed by Ms. Tolan.
First, thank you. I'm thrilled at the direction the ERFC is going. I know that you've done quite a bit to cut cost and to drive up returns, and so that's wonderful. And you seem to be, frankly, being as successful as the best of the money managers, so that's great. My one question, though, is, on one of your slides, and I don't remember if it's on these or one that I looked at prior to the meeting, you indicated that there was going to be an expectation that there would need to be another budgetary adjustment from the school board. What amount are you expecting? And how, I know that we've made pretty significant infusions in the past, and so what's the plan on trying to curb the extraordinary addition?
That's a great question. And just to make sure I understood your question correctly, you're asking whether there's going to be an increase to the contribution rates? Okay. So as you can see in this slide, in 2023, your contributions will stay the same as they are this year. The next time we look at that, adjusting that, if there is an adjustment, and I can't tell you if it's going to go up or down, it's just really going to be dependent on circumstances, is going to be, we're going to have this discussion with the ERFC school board the middle of next year. And at that point, we should be able to give you some kind of an idea what direction it's going.
The reason I ask is that we jumped for fiscal year 2022 from 6.44 to 6.7.
Yeah.
And when you look at that as since 2014 as being over 1%, it's probably going in the wrong direction. And I know that's why we made adjustments in 2017 because of the concerns of the continuing cost.
Yeah, so I think that's a good segue to talk about, what we're doing as an organization. I talked about some of the cost-saving measures that we've already implemented. There's some things we can control and some things that we can't control. The things that we can't control to start off is the market gains and losses. We're invested as diversified investors in the market. We have a very strong portfolio. As you so keenly indicated, we've competed with the best of the best. Just as a reference point, even CalPERS, which is the largest pension plan in the nation, for those of you who don't know, who have, in terms of scale, 100 times the resources that we have as an organization, we outperformed them by about 4% this year. It's very significant. And so, but those are things that we don't control. We can be diversified investors, and that's all we can do. Now, in terms of the other things, I think the question in my mind would be if you had some sense for, will there be pay increase? Will there be more people added? Will there be any more changes from this governing body? I might be able to come up with a better answer in terms of the potential increase, because those, as you can see here, have an impact on the contribution rate. And sometimes we're just looking for estimates, and those definitely have an impact.
Raises a very important question, which is as we look at changing pay scales and a portion that we never see when we get it's going to cost X million, is what is it? It's X million in operating cost, but how much additional will we have to long-term invest in the ERFC? And I'm fully supportive of the ERFC. I just think it's actually a wonderful vehicle that every employee should be participating in.
Thank you. Ms. Tolan, followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
Hi there. Thank you for being here, and thank you for all the time you've spent with myself and constituents in Drainsville to talk through the pension program. Appreciate it. Just a couple of questions. Can you tell us, we have a discount rate of 7.25%, and I fully understand that for public pension plans that is well within the norm. What is the average rate for commercial pension funds?
That's a great question. I don't follow commercial plans, and I'm assuming when you say commercial, private sector,
Correct.
Corporate plans, I don't follow it. We can probably do some research and get back to you, though.
Okay, I would just be curious about that and how we compare there. So if you look at slide 17, even though we show that we have a funded ratio of 76.6%, and I again understand that that is well within other public funds, we still see a significant increase from 2011 to 2020 of our unfunded liability. So it seems that we're mostly with the payments that we do make, which are substantial annually, we're barely paying off our interest part of our mortgage, and our mortgage is still going up and up. So I don't know if you can explain that a little bit, or do we need to really look at the potential of reducing our discount rate in order to lower this unfunded liability?
Great question, and it's actually a pretty complex question, but I'm going to try to simplify the answer because this is a very deep question. So, in terms of our liability increasing and what drives that, we already looked at some of the factors, the things that we don't control at ERFC and the things that this governing body controls. But the biggest by far factor in terms of things that we don't control is the market, right? So the market over the last, if you think about what has happened over the last 10 years, in 2008, the market had a devastating year. I think we all can remember the Great Recession. And as we look at that number, and most funds went down about 50% of their value in 2008. And what that means as an organization is that has an impact on the liabilities of the fund and on the mortgage of the fund. And so if we didn't make that 7.25% and instead we were down 50%, and not saying that we were, but if we're talking generally in terms of the plans, that has an impact on the liabilities. Your mortgage is still something that you need to pay down, and that year we weren't able to pay it down. It gets it gets amortized over the next 5 years, and that any losses that we have market-wise over the next 5 years also gets amortized. So in short, the market downturns have an impact on the mortgage. And that's by far probably the biggest factor. And I think I would encourage you to think about this. It's not intuitive. If you think about lowering the assumed rate of return, the idea is that we're going to fund quicker. Yes, and I would be happy to take a lower assumed rate of return because that makes my job a lot easier. But what that means for you as an organization, and just so that we understand what happens, the dynamics, is that for you as a plan sponsor, that means you get to guarantee that extra money that was previously there. So your contributions, the moment that we did that, your contributions would skyrocket. So your bill, you're basically saying, we don't trust the market anymore. We as an organization are going to make up that difference. And so again, while that makes my job very easy, that's something that you might want to consider.
Right. Yeah, it's not a zero. Well, things move together. Okay. Thank you for that explanation. And I don't know if this is premature to bring this up, but I know you've had some discussions about, given the volatility in the markets and uncertainties and the really low interest rate right now, I don't know how you feel about this idea of using some kind of a pension bond to reduce the unfunded liability. Do you think that's a viable option? And if so, how could we potentially help you with that? I mean, I say that in light of, Karen Corporate Center's comment as well. I feel like this is a very important program and I want to see it out there and available for our employees way down the road. So, is this a creative way that we could look at making the program more viable?
That's a great question. I think in terms of a pension bond obligation, that's something that's a county decision. So it's not something that I would even be involved in. I can tell you in terms of, your first question that you alluded to in terms of the interest rates. And as it pertains to our portfolio, we're very well diversified. So we're positioned in a way, and our performance vets that out, we're positioned in a way to take advantage of low interest rate environments as well. Our private markets portfolio is taking advantage of things that the common individual or the layperson cannot access on their own in, say, a 401k. So we're well positioned to take advantage of the low interest rate environment. But in terms of the pension bond obligation, I think that's a broader county, maybe a joint discussion that you might want to have with them.
Okay, and just one other quick question. Can you talk a little bit, I know you have a new person on your board who's very well qualified. Can you talk in general about the qualifications of the trustees on the board? And is there a way that we should maybe look at increasing their, development around working with pension funds? It's very complicated.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because that gives me an opportunity to thank my board and also point out how hard they work to get the results that we have. I don't know how many of you know this, but some of your leadership staff is on our board, Marty, Lee, and Sean, Kimberly, who's sitting there in the back, and a couple other trustees who are not here today, work very, very hard to accomplish what we accomplished. So I owe them a debt of gratitude for what they've done. In terms of the qualifications are set by our enabling ordinance. So we don't have a say in terms of who gets on there. I can tell you that our trustees they get education at every single board meeting. I can tell you someone like Kimberly Adams who has, I lost track of the hours she spends educating herself, and she does a tremendous job of continuing education, and that goes the same for all of our trustees. You mentioned Adam McConaughey, who is our newest trustee. He has a double master's. He has a background in trading securities and has worked for a securities organization for his entire career, and now manages a private markets portfolio. So I feel like our board is extremely qualified and has the education to back that up.
Thank you. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tolan. We have Ms. McLaughlin next, and Ms. Derenak Kofax, did you take your placard down?
Yes, my questions were answered. Thank you all
Great.
for being here.
Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. I want to drill down a little further on Ms. Corbett Sanders' question, because I really want to better understand this. The chart where it's showing the bar graph on our unfunded levels. So again, I want to understand that chart, and then the one that shows where the employer contribution is going to be going up to 6.7%. See if I can pull that up. So, the clock gets stopped. There we go. Thank you. So I think this is really important here, and I really didn't feel like we're really getting to the gist of what's happening here. I mean, there's a definite shift, and I would like to understand, I mean, when you see an employer contribution is going to go up from 6.44 to 6.7, across being the third largest employer in Virginia, that's sizable. So what's that translate to dollars into the fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23? If you could stop the clock, I want to see what they can tell us.
Yeah, in terms of, I'll answer your last question. In terms of dollars, I think maybe your staff would be better positioned. I could probably come back with it. It really translates into percent of payroll, 6.7% of payroll. We can get that. We can circle back with you. I don't have that with me. But in terms of the trend, I don't know if there was a question there that I can answer. Did you want to know what?
I mean, I have to say, I'm sitting here very respectfully wanting to follow everything, and you gave us a lot of detailed slides, but this to me, when we're getting an annual report, if our financial advisors aren't telling us, again, on our payroll, that's going to be a substantial, millions of dollars. What's going on, and how do we mitigate that? Like, I don't know how we're just supposed to go, oh, well, absorb 6.44 to now 6.7, and there's nothing we can do about it while we saw our returns go up.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're missing information on what's going on.
Mr. Martinez, when you answer that, could you reference that 22, while you made the demarcation future year, that contribution increase was last year for the FY22 budget, if I'm not mistaken?
That's right.
So that was discussed last year with the board?
That's correct.
Correct, sir?
Yes.
Okay, just for clarification, but the way the chart is looked, I think Ms. McLaughlin is thinking there is an additional budget adjustment coming for this year's budget, and there is not.
Well, there
Just-
isn't,
just for
but-
reference.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, but it is a layering effect. It means that's an ongoing, it's not like it was a one-year impact. We're now living in that new reality. And so is there anything we can do to mitigate that? Or is that our new reality until the next bump happens? And to Karen Corbett Sanders' point, 2014, you go up almost a whole percentage point. Is that normal? Is that what, ESSERS is experiencing, what the VRS is experiencing? Like, we have a responsibility to understand, are we an outlier in what's happening here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and your concern is very valid. I think looking at the trend, if you think back, and I don't have this on here, but if you look back at 2012, there's things, again, that we don't control as an organization, as ERFC. That employee rate was at 4%. And that's something that you, again, as a board, as a governing body, you control that green bar. So it was 4%, you reduced it in 2012. I believe it was in light of the fact that you couldn't increase salaries, and so you gave some concessions on this rate. That's been that way since 2012. So that's one piece that obviously we don't control. The other part, again, we talked about the market and what the impact that has, and we talked about 2008, and there's costs baked into that downside performance in 2008. That was a very traumatic year for every single pension plan in the industry, which is why you see the national average in the 70% range. We've done substantially better than the national average. I would say that there's things that we don't necessarily control as part of what we do what you do here as a governing body, and one of you already highlighted this, what you do here as a governing body has an impact and a ripple effect on the pension fund costs. So there's things that even on our best day, I've known funds that are 100% funded, even in their best day, if the plan sponsor makes changes, that has an impact and could have the potential effect of lowering their funded status. So there's a lot of things that we do, a lot of things that we don't. We manage the money, we invest it. We try to do that in a way that's cost efficient, and I've shared with you some of the things that we've done to lower the cost. But at the end of the day, our costs for administering the plan are fairly de minimis compared to the actual costs of paying the benefits.
Ms. McLaughlin, if I could. Mr. Smith, did you want to make a point?
Oh, I was only going to add that as part of the FY22 budget, there was about a $5.3 million increase for retirement, which was a combination of ERFC and FCERS. As you look at all of the indicators that Mr. Martinez highlighted in terms of increasing costs, so as those increasing costs occur, then Fairfax County's portion also increases. And you've noted that we've seen those increases on the ERFC side. We've also seen increases on the FCERS side. But again, it was $5.3 million for FY22.
Megan, I just want to add and just say it, sometimes I just want to say it, Scott's language. 2012, we had that huge recession. We had the impacts. No one was getting paid. The board, I was on the leadership team. I wasn't superintendent, obviously, a tough call. We can't pay you more, but can we reduce the employee contribution from 4% to 3%? That was a big change. It was a big change, and it's lasted 10 years. Where are we now? We have more people. Our enrollment's gone up in a decade in this school system. Pay increases. We did a record amount under Dr. Garza to begin to position that market pay to teachers, and we finished some of that work right before this pandemic. That added to the capacity needs of ERFC. So we're doing good, the market's doing good, but the point you and Mrs. Corbett-Sanders are raising, it's something we've got to continue to put an eye on and make the balancing act between what's the right contribution for the employer and for the employee. ERFC remains an amazing value added for Fairfax County Public Schools and for our employees who cannot find, as you look in the private sector or even the public sector, cannot find this kind of program. Feeling confident in retirement is part of their, in a retirement feeling confident is part of their new phrase for ERFC. There is no greater confidence than if you're an employee in Fairfax County Public Schools about your retirement than almost anywhere in the country. We have to continue to be good stewards, and we have to continue to tell our employees this is a value proposition, and as we move forward to continue to have it, it's a value proposition borne by both the employer and the employee. And finding the right balance for that 10 years from when we did lower the contribution is probably a conversation as the board continues to move forward. Right now, the market is really helping. You know, this year, to be honest, our pay increase was much lower. So, you know, again, these are all the factors, and I really do love this chart that helps understand. Final comment to just make, the new plan, remember, the new plan is lower cost, and by 2040, the mortgage is paid off. That's a good position to be in compared to many private and public sector systems. That was a decision too, 2040, made many, many years ago by prior boards, and the ERFC board is a target, and it's a very fiscally, I think, conservative and responsible one to do.
And Scott, the FCERS was what we invested more in 2022 than in the ERFC, if I remember correctly.
I believe that's correct. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe that's correct, yes.
So sticking with what might be an apples-to-apples comparison, I noticed we're just getting comparators with Fairfax County government employee local pension funds. What about how we did compared to the VRS? Is that not an appropriate comparator?
Great question. We do have that information because I know it's asked here every year, but my personal opinion that it's not a very good comparison to VRS. If you think about VRS, it's a much larger fund. They have many more resources than us. I think they're up at close to $100 billion in assets, maybe more now. We have $3.3 billion in assets and 28 staff. They have close to 1,000 people working for them. So definitely not a good comparison. But the number, 1.4% as of the end of 2020. Again, 2020, we performed at the top 5% of funds nationally at 4.7%. We protected the fund. And then this year, we participated on the upside, which is even harder to do as well, to do it on both ends.
So I appreciate that. I again, want to support the things that my colleagues have said, and recognize, obviously, size and staffing and all of that plays a role. But I do want to be mindful that as a next step for me, I really do want to have someone help me understand going from 6.44 now to 6.7. If the employee and the employer are both paying in, then I still don't understand how ours went up and what's driving that. And I don't want to go all the way back to the recession because that was, now, 13 years ago as we moved out of it. It's something happened in the last few years, and I want to understand from that point and going forward how we got to that. So it might just be someone needs to show me the math on paper. So, because I'm a visual learner.
I'm happy to have a conversation with you or others on this, maybe a two-bite. I'm happy to have that conversation. We've done that in the past with others, and it's worked very well, or I'm happy to provide the information for the entire board if you need it. But I'm happy to help in any way I can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Dr. Anderson?
Thank you. Actually, Megan hit on the head what my questions were, and I just want to very quickly say, since you already responded to the bulk of them, I would be very happy to be part of that because I don't have a good understanding of this increase either. And thank you, Dr. Brabrand, for sharing with those of us who were not on the board in 2012 the change that was made regarding the employee contributions, because I did have some questions around that. So I will just save the rest of my questions for an opportunity to speak with you, whether it's one by one or individually or the 2x2, because I do want to delve into this a little bit more.
Thank you. Ms. Cohen?
Thank you, and I just want to say to Mr. Martinez and his team, thank you so much. Our meeting managers, and then you met with Ms. Tolan and myself last year when we had some questions. So thank you. We appreciate it. A couple of just quick questions I wanted to ask. It looks like from just quick math of the different groupings that you gave us that we've got just over about 22,000 employees that participate. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay. And then of those 22,000, do you have a sense of what the participation rates are versus by employee groups? Like what are teachers versus support employees?
That's a good question. And ERFC as a plan is a mandatory plan. So if you're a member of, if you're an employee of FCPS and you qualify as one of the groups that fits into the ERFC, you don't have an option. So I would hope it would be 100%.
Okay. And those are, just to make sure that I clarify, those are full-time employees, not our contracted hourly, right? These are just full-time. That might be Sean.
It is full-time employees.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. And then just to get back to Ms. McLaughlin's question about payment categories, one thing I just wanted you, if you don't mind, going back to highlight is that we are almost done with that legacy. And isn't that a more costly payback than what are other plans going forward?
Yeah, that's a very keen observation. Obviously, the legacy plan, which was established in 1973, was a much more generous plan than the later two plans. And as a result, it is also more costly for you as a plan sponsor. And the way you want to think about these is you're creating these plans, you as a governing body, I'm not saying you as individuals here today, but you as a governing body at some point in the past create these plans. and they come in with different dynamics, and it definitely, in terms of cost, I would say from left to right, greatest to smallest.
Awesome. And the only last thing I just wanted to highlight from the conversations that we were able to have prior to this is just assuring the board too that you guys very closely work with HR to monitor retirements and ensuring that we're not going to wind up with a really big influx that then kind of throws our typical plan out of whack.
Yeah, definitely we're monitoring the retirements, and by the way, as I mentioned earlier, some of your leadership is on the ERFC board. Sean is on our board, and we get monthly reports to them in terms of the retirements. I can tell you, if you're curious, because it is something that has been on all our minds in terms of will there be a spike in retirements because of the overall situation, and so I can tell you that hasn't been the case. In 2020, we had 620 retirements. In 2021, we had 641.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'll just take a moment. Appreciate you mentioning CalPERS. My father retired on CalPERS 30 years ago, and they still have a stable home, and I think that's what we all want for folks in their pensions. And I appreciate all that you all are doing to manage this effectively. I would note, and this has nothing to do with the work that you do, that when we talk about this being deferred compensation, many of the questions we've been asking and commenting on, the points about whether staff will be contributing 3% or 4%, those are all conversations that happen in the picture of, we can't give you a raise, so here's this, right? And so when we make decisions around these numbers, we have to remember that we start from a point of view of already not paying our staff enough. And so when we move these numbers, it's a reflection of the value that we place on our staff. Additionally, pardon? Well, I appreciate the open dialogue. Additionally, when we look at the various, the legacy, 2001 Tier 1, Tier 2, we're talking about programs that are less robust over time. And so that is also a reflection of our commitment to the deferred compensation of our employees. So that's what I think about when I think about ERFC. And I do appreciate the work that goes into these presentations. And the numbers speak for themselves in the ability to manage the fund. So I appreciate that. We've got two go-backs, Ms. Tolan followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Just a quick question. Can you remind me, I know you very thoroughly every 2 years audit everything and go through everything with an independent consultant. Can you just explain that to the board maybe? And I think that's where if you look at that chart on page 19, where you see the difference in the percentage of contribution, that is a recommendation that will come out of that review. Is that correct?
Let me just take your first question in terms of the auditing schedule and how often it gets audited. We do have a pretty robust auditing process. As a matter of fact, in 2018, you could say that the fund was audited 3 times by 3 different actuarial firms that are nationally recognized as the best in their industry. So in 2018, we had 3 audits and they all came out with flying colors. So the audit process is very, very robust. And we do this every 5 years. And if we're looking at changing the rates, this is something that happens every second year, and which is why you kind of see here in 22 and 23, the rate has already been set. We look at our rate based on the performance for the end of the calendar year. So this year, knock on wood, the performance will stay strong. December 31st will yield great returns, and we'll look at that as a setting point for the contribution rates for 2024 and 2025. So you'll have basically a 2-year advance notice on which way the rates are going to go. And this, just so we're clear, rates don't always go up. There could be a potential that they come down, but that's just really dependent on what you do and then how the market performs as well.
Okay, so December 2021, you'll have another review?
December 2021, yeah, the end of this year. It's a valuation. We base it off of the valuation at the end of the year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tolan. Ms. Corbett-Sanders?
Very
Followed by
quick.
Ms. McLaughlin.
Very quick question. The asset class mix that you have a nice little pie chart there. I know that more and more groups are pulling out of the pure stock market because the stock market is not performing at the same level as some of the private investment groups and private investment funds. Where do you see that happening with this? Because it looks like 42% are stocks. I take the real estate is in REITs, real estate investment trust, or is it owned real estate?
Yeah, I love to talk about investments, so I love this question.
So do I. So just
So in terms of your first question, is it a bad idea to be in stocks at this point? It is a question that every single pension plan out there is struggling in today, not only because of the market climate around interest rates, but also the fact that we've had a tremendous bull year. The last bull year, even the last 5 years have been phenomenal in spite of what happened during COVID-19. So it's been a great run, and that does weigh on our minds. What I can tell you in terms of our portfolio, we're already ahead of that. So our private markets portfolio is currently being built out. We don't invest in REITs. Those REITs are more highly correlated to stocks. So if we invest in REITs, we'd basically invest in stocks. But we do invest in private real estate. We invest in private infrastructure. We invest in private credit and private equity as a whole. Now, there's a whole education around private markets, so I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but just know that we're slated to increase our private markets allocation, and where that's going to come from is going to come from the equity side.
And that was precisely what I was asking, because you only have 8% up there, and I know that a lot of the other big funds are moving more heavily into private markets.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If I may just so that we private markets at 8% as a whole. If you look at real estate, and if you look at some of the things that we have in multi-asset class solutions, and again, we can get really complicated really fast here, but just know as a whole, we're up about 23-24% in private market exposure. And so I think we're very well prepared to take advantage of those opportunities.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin?
Yes, I just wanted to formally get my clarifying question, because I wasn't trying to be rude to Mr. Frisch. You were commenting about the value we place on employees and going from 3% to 4%. And my interjection of we weren't saying that is only because I know from all these years how much our employees value these benefits. And I wanted to genuinely understand from you or any of our colleagues, did anyone take away from the comments being made here that this board was even considering touching or changing the employee contribution? Because I hadn't heard that, and I know that causes a lot of consternation for our employees based on the limits we've had on raises. Was something said here today that raised a concern for you that we might be wanting to change that?
No, I was providing further context to the discussion around those two numbers.
Okay, so again, just for...
I realize that we often hear something entirely different than what other people might hear.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate you doing it through parliamentary procedure.
Yeah, no, I know that even the board of supervisors had started to have conversations about their pensions in general, and I saw that it caused a lot of concern, not just for their employees on just the dialogue on it, but then our employees started to wonder, are we going down that path? And so
And that's why I thought it was important to point out that when we talk about these numbers and why they've been changed over the years,
Yeah.
that it is a question of deferred compensation, and that's the point I made.
Yeah, and in a good way, that Dr. Brabrand, you definitely put a fine point on it, because it happened right about the time that Ms. Koufax and I joined the board, that it had gone years from '08 recession to now 12. What can we do here? And so I only simply want to know what we need to do on our end, knowing that for every $1 million that we have to pour into this, we can't staff and add extra positions. So we just need to know what's driving the numbers, not that we're looking to change anything on the impact for our employees.
Yeah, absolutely. All I would just say is this board has always embraced best practices, and having the fiscal accountability to have ERFC present annually to this board, to see the numbers, to discuss it. It's not to get people excited or anxious, but it's to bring the facts, the results, and to continue to have these conversations. And I think something Mr. Martinez said is any changes to contribution for employer or employee can be forecasted 2 years out. And right now, it's steady as we go, but we need to look at these trends. And as we talk about the future of the school system and the future of compensation, deferred and current, these are all pieces of information the board and the community need to understand as we make decisions. So I think it's so good that the board brings this each year. Last year, we were in the middle of the pandemic, and I'll be honest, it was a briefer presentation and less Q&A. And now, as we're kind of working to get out of the pandemic, having this discussion, having more Q&A, I think has been a great thing today for the board and frankly for the community as well.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for sharing this information with us. We're going to take our break for lunch.
Thank you.
We'll be back at 2 o'clock.